Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to finally have the opportunity to cover the very release that inspired me to create this channel in the first place. In this video, I'll be providing not just an overview, but also my initial, very first, and immediate impressions of our recently released and brand new first Deluxe Expansion, the Great Devourer, which finally introduces the 8th Tyranid faction in its full playable form to Conquest. Because this box set was sold exclusively and in limited quantities to Gen Con 2015 attendees alone and is not yet available as a widespread retail release, this video is only going to encompass my very first thoughts and quite literal first impressions of a set of cards I've yet to have the opportunity to actually play with. Though I'll definitely be reviewing all of these cards as well as the non-Tyranid cards included within the Great Devourer box set in far more thorough and exhaustive detail in a full, future, comprehensive, and exhaustive analysis. For now, suffice it to say that any opinions I share today are based strictly off of theory alone, so over the course of this video, I encourage you to share your own thoughts, opinions, and impressions of any or even all of these cards in the comments section below, and be sure to mention some of your personal favorites, as well as the most powerful combos and synergies you think of or come across. Please keep in mind that I did not attend Gen Con this year, so I've regrettably yet to get my hands on our Tyranid box set myself, and as a result, any and all thoughts expressed in this video are indeed simply my first impressions and definitely subject to change over time, particularly once I've had the chance to actually playtest some of these cards. And without the help of Tyler Thompson from the Warhammer 40k Concast podcast, as well as a friend of mine, Travis McDaniel, I would not have been able to provide the excellent photographs of cards in this video I've included for your viewing enjoyment today. But with that said, let's not waste another moment and kick off this monstrously long review with the first of our two brand new unique Tyranid warlords, Old One-Eye. He has 2 attacks, 6 hit points, a starting hand size of 6, and 6 starting resource tokens. He has the creature and behemoth traits, and the text reaction. After this warlord readies, remove half the damage from it, albeit limit once per round. It's definitely worth noting that Old One-Eye's pool of HP is boosted up to 7 as soon as you affix his signature attachment, and owing to the nature of his regenerative ability, he makes a potentially fantastic damage sponge. His signature army unit is fragile for its cost, but happens to have a reaction which allows you to reassign any source of damage from it to Old One-Eye. So in that sense, you're able to get even more mileage out of this warlord's sizable hit point supply. Definitely worth noting is that although you can only remove damage tokens from our named Carnifex warlord a maximum of once per full game round, you always round up when it comes to removing damage, so at most, if you've accumulated 6 or 5 points of damage on Old One-Eye, you nevertheless end up stripping away a sizable 3 damage tokens in either case, which, if he happens to possess his HP increasing signature attachment, also provides the additional bonus of boosting his attack power. Whereas our second Tyranid warlord is all about dealing damage through amassing individually and weak when unaugmented Termagant tokens, Old One-Eye instead is able to pack much more of an immediate punch in and of itself. Really, the only granted enormous downside to Old One-Eye is that, when bloodied, he is immediately, rather effectively neutered. Instead of a base 2 attack and 6 hit points, he's suddenly left with no more than a single point for his attack value, but he does maintain a reasonable 6 health. He just suddenly happens to completely lose his usually potent, often near invaluable regenerative ability, but nevertheless, even at that point, he still could pack a bit of an unexpectedly hard punch and make quite the attack value impact during combat, if it just so happens that you're able to make good use of his brutal keyword conferring signature event, even in the face of his being unfortunately or tragically bloodied. But, in continuing our coverage of our first warlord as well as his associated signature squad, taking a look now at Old One-Eye's signature army unit, we have the Lurking Hormigaunt, with a cost of 2, a single command icon, an attack value of 3, and not but a single point for HP value. It has the creature and behemoth traits and reaction. After this unit is assigned damage, reassign up to 2 of that damage to your warlord instead. So, for the cost, it has an entirely respectable command phase value in often either being able to break even with any present opposing units or, potentially, even winning command struggles outright, particularly when unopposed, and because it doesn't have to be located at the same planet as your warlord to trigger its reaction, you can deploy it for the most part wherever you'd like, to take advantage of it in a command sense, while all the while resting fairly safe and secure in knowing you can assign away any, or perhaps all, damage it might incur to your warlord that may very well simply end up being later regenerated away as if nothing had ever happened in the first place. And I definitely think that's preferable to losing the card and 2 resource tokens you bothered investing in this unit. It hits rather hard with an attack value of 3 despite that mere cost of 2, and considering that you can assign away damage from almost any source, be it from an attack, area effect, or perhaps even from the rare bit of indirect damage, this glass cannon style Tyranid nevertheless can quickly prove to be rather resilient indeed. The clincher, though, is that if you do end up assigning a large amount of damage to your warlord, and note that there is no limit on the number of times you can reassign damage, just not more than 2 points per instance of reassignment, you just need to ensure you find some way to exhaust Old One-Eye, usually by attacking or retreating, so that he can ultimately ready and end up peeling away half of his accrued damage tokens. If he isn't involved in combat and never gets an opportunity to exhaust, then he won't get an opportunity to ready and will not be able to regenerate, so it's therefore of the utmost importance that you do find some means of removing any accrued damage under most circumstances from your warlord when possible. But in any case, next up in Old One-Eye's signature squad is the formidable and fortifying attachment Great Scything Talons. It has a cost of 1, an enormous 3 shield icons, and the war gear and biomorph traits. It must be attached to your warlord and confers the attached unit plus 1 HP. It reads reaction. After damage is removed from attached unit, it gets plus X attack for its next attack this phase. X is the amount of damage removed. So, although it's quite clearly risky to do so, once you affix this attachment, the more damage Old One-Eye takes, the more damage he ultimately removes on average, and all the harder he's subsequently able to strike back at your enemy, albeit for only his next single attack against a single eligible target opponent. So, if you end up accruing 5 points of damage on your warlord, at the end of the first combat round he readies, removes 3 damage tokens, and, so long as your opponent doesn't retreat, if he survives long enough to have an opportunity to take another combat turn, he can lash out for a rather respectable 5 points of damage, putting a monumental amount of pressure on your opponent to shield as much of that damage away as they can, or perhaps simply outright eliminating his target, which is hopefully going to be a high value or otherwise simply contextually, situationally dangerous and imposing enemy unit. Next, in Old One-Eye's signature squad, is the support Awakening Cavern, requiring an investment of 3 resources and possessing the Location trait. It reads Action. Exhaust this support to ready a target unit you control. So, clearly this is a versatile and flexible, albeit very expensive Tyranid support. It's likely worth saving until you need it the very most, and although it could certainly be useful during the early game, that significant resource sink could nevertheless hold you back in both a command and combat phase sense from establishing a favorable board state on the tabletop, simply because it asks such a steep initial investment of you that, in all honesty, could likely be better spent, in the early game at least, elsewhere. Keep in mind that this can work on any and all of your units and has nearly innumerable uses. You can attack with your warlord and then use your next available combat turn to retreat. When our card pool eventually expands, you might very well be able to use additional actions to someday trigger multiple abilities, and eventually this support may even allow Old One-Eye himself to exhaust to pay, perhaps, for multiple events that might require him to exhaust. Perhaps the most obvious use of this support is to have a powerful unit, maybe an elite, attack twice during a given combat round, and if you can take advantage of the area effect or perhaps armorbane keywords in particular, then this support could be utterly devastating indeed. Plus, it also happens to have contextual use when you're going up against the likes of Eldar or Astra Militarum opponents. Whether it's Eldorath or Suppressive Fire exhausting your units, you can, in turn, respond by readying them with this support, in order to dash your opponent's dreams of preventing whatever actions they were afraid of. Just keep in mind that there's no action window allowing you to ready a unit after they're exhausted by Eldorath during the command phase, prior to your resolving that round's command struggles. But last, though most certainly not least, for our first warlord is the signature event Ferocious Strength. With a cost of 1 shield icon, and the trait Power, Action. Your warlord, or a synapse unit you control, gains brutal until the end of the combat round. Notably, it does not say phase, so, depending entirely upon how many damage tokens he's accumulated, this allows Old One-Eye to gain up to a maximum of 5 additional attack power for the first round of combat, and 6 if he happens to have his signature attachment affixed. And then, once he has attacked and the combat round ultimately does come to a close, he then readies, loses the brutal keyword, and removes half of his accumulated damage tokens. At that point, if it just so happens that he does have his signature attachment, he then gains attack equal to the number of damage regenerated away. Or, alternatively, if you wait until the second or later round of combat to trigger this event, combined with his activated attachment, it is ultimately possible to have Old One-Eye attack for a grand total of 11, although only for a single attack, which nevertheless does happen to make him thus far the potentially hardest hitting warlord we've seen in our entire card pool to date. Of course, you need not save this event strictly for your warlord, as any of the 5 Synapse units we've yet to cover, which were released in the Great Devourer, are also eligible targets for this event, although they only have 4 or 5 hit points apiece. Nevertheless, if laden with damage, they're perfectly able to suddenly launch a respectably formidable attack against absolutely whatever it is that they happen to be facing. So, now that we've covered our first Tyranid option for Warlord, but before we move on to our second, it only makes sense that first we introduce something that's going to be referenced almost endlessly throughout the remainder of this video, the initially lowly Termagant token. Although their deceptively simple 1 attack, 1 HP creature and Termagant trait tokens, with the help of what are known as Hive Mind Specialization Army units, they can nevertheless become respectable, even fearsome, and overwhelmingly powerful attackers in their own right, so long as they happen to be present at the same planet as the right Hive Mind Specialization unit. They can either gain +1 attack, +1 command icon, +2 hit points, or even the ranged or area effect keywords. And if there just so happen to be multiple copies of the associated ability-conferring Hive Mind unit present at that same planet, it's certainly worth keeping in mind just how powerful these tokens have the potential to become, seeing as how all of those aforementioned effects are indeed additive in nature. But next, now that we have covered our first Tyranid option for Warlord, let's move on to the Termagant token generating alternative, the Swarm Lord, with an attack value of 2, 6 hit points, and a starting hand size of 6, as well as 6 starting resources. He has the creature and behemoth traits, and reads Reaction. After this Warlord commits to a planet, put 1 Termagant token into play at each adjacent planet. So, whereas Old One-Eye himself is a formidable combatant that can, potentially, conjure up enormous amounts of attack power, the Swarm Lord instead relies on the synergy between Termagants and Hive Mind Specialization units in order to excel in both a command and combat sense. He's far less durable than our first Warlord, but nevertheless does possess a reasonable pool of HP, as well as a sufficient base attack value to allow him to snipe and destroy early game enemy command units. Plus, so long as you can prevent him from being deployed to either the first or last planets, or there's only 1 planet remaining on the tabletop, you can ensure you derive the absolute utmost value out of his ability by generating the maximum number of Termagant tokens each and every turn. I just certainly think it's of paramount importance to mention up front and immediately that you prevent his being bloodied under nearly any circumstances possible, seeing as how not only is his ability to spawn such synergistic tokens all but certainly invaluable, also, once his stats suddenly decrease to 2 attack and a mere 5 hit points, he suddenly becomes not just a fantastic candidate to cost you the game through his assassination, but also he immediately looks about as durable and useful during combat as one of your hardier choices of still relatively fragile Synapse units. Perhaps the optimal or most efficient use of the Swarm Lord is to commit him to a planet where he can kill an enemy command unit, while at the same time serving to deposit Termagant tokens alongside Hive Mind specialization units at planets adjacent to his own, in order to set yourself up into a favorable position when entering that round's command and combat phases. And, regardless of your choice of Synapse unit, which I'll be covering and explaining in depth in just a few minutes, it seems rather likely that with the Swarm Lord, you're possibly entirely capable of achieving a rather daunting, even intimidating command and combat presence on potentially nearly every significant planet composing the battlefield. So, if you're playing the Swarm Lord, so long as you can keep your Warlord from being bloodied, it seems rather likely that you can not only serve to deplete your enemy's command units through Warlord sniping over time, but in doing so, you could quite literally fill your side of the Traxxas sector with what hopefully are soon to become respectably powerful Tyranid Termagant token units. But, if you didn't already assume by the nature of his ability, by no means is the Swarm Lord meant to succeed on his own. So, first up in his signature squad are the Brood Warriors, a 2-cost army unit with 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and 2 hit points. They possess the Creature and Leviathan traits, and are the very first of our Hive Mind specialization units. They read Hive Mind. Each Termagant token you control at this planet gains 1 command icon. So, wholly respectable and entirely cost-appropriate stats aside, these signature units serve you the additional benefit of conferring a significant additive command presence to each and every Tyranid token present at their location. Considering that the Swarm Lord himself can deposit up to 1 token at potentially 2 adjacent planets each and every round, and that further additional Tyranid card effects can easily generate 1 or 2 tokens per play or use, taken all together, any number of different card effects can easily amount to a rather sizable number of tokens and resultant command value that, by merit of its being distributed among many units and not just concentrated within one, it's therefore much less easily countered by effects like exhaustion than would be something along the lines of a Tyranid elite unit laden with 3 or 4 printed command icons. Your opponent can't deny your entire allotment of command simply by knocking out 1 unit when they have 3 or more command equal token and army units all sitting at the same planet. Plus, beyond likely winning you additional cards and resources each and every turn, it's reasonably likely to survive incurring small instances of damage, such as the 1 damage relocating ping from a Captain Cato Sicarius' signature army unit, Sicarius' Chosen, or also a single assigned point of indirect damage from the 1-cost support Orc Cannon. And beyond simply that, by having 2 attack power, it's also able to deal out a respectable bit of damage during combat as well. So, all around, I can't find much negative to say about this unit. It's just definitely worth noting that, for any of our Hive Mind specialization units, they don't necessarily do much in and of themselves. Just like the Swarm Lord, they're rather dependent upon your generating and maintaining an adequate quantity of Termagant tokens to really derive the maximum value and utility out of them. So, whereas Old One-Eye had his great scything talons, the Swarm Lord instead has the unique signature attachment Bone Sabers, which, for a cost of 1, possess 3 shield icons, as well as the war gear and biomorph traits. It reads, attached to your Warlord, attached unit gets +1 attack, serving to bring the Swarm Lord to a respectable 3. Further, it reads Reaction. After attached unit destroys an enemy army unit by an attack, put one Termagant token into play at this planet. So, while this potentially allows you to generate an additional Termagant token each and every round of combat, serving to punish your opponent for prolonging a battle, if it just so happens that your enemy chooses to shield your warlord's attacks, so that he never does deal a killing blow against an army unit specifically, you're essentially unable to ever take advantage of this reaction. Still, in a best-case scenario, you are able to kill potentially fragile enemy units when you can in an opportunistic sense, and this serves to supplement your existing battlefield forces with an additional buffer of extra tokens. It's definitely worth noting that this does not trigger from your bloodying a warlord or killing an enemy token or even synapse unit, and because of those limitations, I think that it's entirely possible this card may often enough be simply used up as a shield in order to preserve the Swarmlord, which loses so much of his potency and utility if it just so happens that he ends up bloodied. Plus, given just how wildly inconsistent the value of Termagant tokens may be at any given point during even a single given phase, whether or not you're ultimately able to generate one or even several of those tokens through this attachment, it could be absolutely fantastic, or alternatively, it simply might not do much. Still, considering just how many other Tyranid cards we have yet to cover, and that many of them are indeed fueled by nothing more than the sheer volume of Termagant tokens you can put into play, particularly if all of those happen to be sitting at the same planet, but even if they happen to be littered all across the tabletop, having yet another means of filling your side of the board with what very well could be powerful, and in any case are almost assuredly at least aggravating to your opponent token units, it's certainly nothing to be taken lightly. Still, considering just how many other Tyranid cards we have yet to cover, and that many of them are fueled by the sheer volume of Termagants alone that you might on occasion be able to put into play, particularly if they happen to be at the same planet, but even if they're instead littered all across the tabletop, having yet another means of potentially filling your board with what could be powerful, and are in any case almost assuredly aggravating to your opponent token units, it's certainly nothing to be taken lightly. And, as with any warlord, the Swarmlord also happens to possess a signature support card, specifically the Leviathan Hive ship, which, for a cost of 3, has the upgrade trait and the text Reaction. After a unit you control with the Hive Mind specialization and printed cost 3 or lower is destroyed, exhaust this support to put that unit into play from your discard pile exhausted at a planet. So, given just how scarcely and as a result precious Hive Mind specialization units can be, the option of immediately resurrecting them upon their destruction could prove to be absolutely invaluable. Not only can you immediately return them to play so that something along the lines of an as of yet undiscussed Strangler Brood army unit once again can play its pivotal role of providing each and every one of your Termagant tokens present at its planet with an additional point of attack power, but if it makes more sense to place that unit at a different planet, you're given the option of, albeit in an exhausted state, returning that unit to play absolutely wherever you'd like, wherever it is that makes the most sense to you in that moment. Maybe it's a planet where a battle is going to later take place during that very phase or round, Or maybe you're simply setting up for the following round in order to secure a devastating combat or command struggle victory. Considering too that there is only a single hive mind specialization unit that costs more than 3, the 6-cost area effect 1 conferring Biovore Spore Launcher, you have a whole range of options with which to choose from that we'll cover more in depth ever so slightly later on in this video. Plus, considering too that you can trigger this reaction during any phase of the game, so long as you don't happen to be sacrificing your own hive mind units, which doesn't actually count as they're being destroyed, this support seems like it's going to be absolutely irreplaceable when it comes to swaying the outcome of some of the most pivotal and decisive battles of a game. And, of course, the very last of the Swarmlord's signature squad is the 2-cost event, Indescribable Horror, with a single shield icon and the tactic trait, Reading Combat Action. Route a target army unit with printed cost equal to or lower than the number of Tyranid units you control at that planet. So, this essentially functions as the Tyranid version of the Dark Eldar event, Archon's Terror, which serves, as a combat action, to rout a target non-unique enemy army unit. However, this has the added restriction that you can only target a unit with a cost no more than the sum of your present units. While this does have the extra added benefit of allowing you to rout uniques, unless you happen to flood that planet with army units or tokens, it seems like it could nevertheless prove quite difficult to rout high-cost, usually elite army units. Still, considering that most of the units which pose the absolute greatest threat to the Swarmlord and his army of Termagants are going to be those possessing ranged or area effect, their costs aren't typically terribly high. For example, a Tau Vior Law marksman with an affixed gun drones attachment, possessing the ranged and area effect 2 keywords, only weighs in at a cost of a mere 2 resources, and a 3-attack ranged Baleful Mandrake only costs 3. Still, even though some of the most formidable and daunting threats to the Swarmlord and his army happen to cost something more along the lines of 5 resources, such as the Chaos Area Effect 3 Vicious Bloodletter, or the Space Marines Fire Drake Terminator that deals 1 damage to each unit that dares declare an attack against it, considering that your Warlord, Synapse, Token, and Army units all count as units toward that sum total present at the planet, it is entirely possible that you might be able to rout even your greatest threat, particularly during the latest few rounds of the game, and especially during the biggest battles. So, if you can rout your enemy, fantastic, and if you can't, then try to find alternative options. Perhaps giving all your Termagant tokens ranged, in addition to an attack power boost, or instead, even opting to play a more elite-heavy Swarmlord build. But nevertheless, whether consistent and reliable or not, through a bit of careful planning and deployment, I think that this will undoubtedly serve to be a tremendous asset in protecting your most valuable units, and often enough, potentially quite vulnerable army. So, now that we've covered our first 2 Tyranid warlords, on to covering one of the most unique aspects of the Tyranid faction as a whole, the mechanic wherein they compensate for a lower than average starting warlord hand size and resource allotment by beginning each game with their choice of one of our available Synapse units in play at their headquarters alongside their selected warlord. During the command phase, thanks to the Tyranid player's special dual command dial, these Synapse units are also sent out and committed to a planet of their controller's choice and although they each happen to have uniquely defining characteristics that help differentiate them from one another, in many ways they essentially function as miniature warlords themselves. It's definitely worth remembering that although the Tyranid player cannot build their deck with cards taken from any other faction, they are nevertheless permitted to include any non-unit neutral cards. And seeing as how each of our first 5 Synapse units possesses the elite trait, the 1-cost neutral event Fallback is absolutely spectacular as soon as an elite unit happens to be destroyed, returning it to play from your discard pile to your HQ. So, considering that Synapse units can be absolutely crucial in winning you additional command struggles each and every round, and providing any number of myriad additional benefits beyond, ensuring that they stay alive through the likes of that event, shield cards, and any number of other effects could be all but mandatory when you're looking at building a Tyranid faction deck. So, as I cover each and every one of our 5 different initial Synapse unit options, consider not only which one of them stands out as most appealing to you, but also which of them might be most effective when run alongside your personal preference of our 2 thus far released Tyranid warlords. But with that conceptual introduction aside, on to the very first of our Synapse units, the unique Blazing Zoanthrope. It has 1 command icon, a single point of attack value, and a pool of 4 hit points. It has the creature, behemoth, and elite traits and reaction. After the combat phase begins, deal 1 damage to a target army unit at this planet. If this planet is infested, deal 2 damage instead, which introduces yet another new mechanic unique to the Tyranid faction, which happens to be infestation tokens. There are a number of new Tyranid cards which happen to infest a planet. That is, that put an infestation token into play at a planet, and this can have several different effects. It can make some Tyranid cards present or played at that planet more powerful in some aspect, or it can instead augment and improve an existing ability, as is the case with the Blazing Zoanthrope's direct damage reaction. Or it can also serve to effectively allow the Tyranid player to unlock the option of using some powerful effect, such as the ability to play a certain event at an infested planet, and only an infested planet. But regardless, the Blazing Zoanthrope is also a great example of how Synapse units can be used to win command struggles. Once the deploy phase ends and you know exactly where your opponent's strong and weak areas of command influence are, you can simply opt to set your dual command dial into committing your Zoanthrope to a planet where 1 additional command icon can secure you a command struggle victory, along with all associated cards, resources, and bonuses that means. Plus, unlike a warlord, unless otherwise specified on the Synapse unit's card, it does not cause a battle to take place at its location, which means that if you don't feel confident in bringing a 1 or even 0 attack value Synapse unit into the battlefield, you need not necessarily do so, unless, of course, you're forced to by perhaps the surprising presence of your opponent's warlord, or perhaps simply by merit of your having committed to the first planet, being at the same planet as your own warlord, or, as is the case with one of our yet-to-be-disclosed Synapse units, it elicits a battle itself. but its ability to dodge actual battles is potentially that which makes the Blazing Zoanthrope just so appealing. Specifically, that it has the potential to not only win command struggles for you, but then, at the beginning of the combat phase, it can deal up to 2 damage at a target enemy army unit present at that planet without necessarily having to worry about suffering any damage at all in return. This could potentially serve to either kill enemy units outright, or, at the very least, deal a point of damage or 2, simply softening up those units for subsequent destruction, or at the absolute very least, apply ever so slightly a small amount of additional pressure for your opponent to be forced to expend valuable events and attachments in the form of shield cards. And always remember that each and every card spent for shielding means that they have one less tool or instrument with which to later leverage against you during that game. So, if you kill a command-savvy unit, it makes it all the more likely that you'll win subsequent command struggles at that planet, or instead, if you manage to snipe some powerful or even middling combatant, you're nevertheless still serving to tip the scales at least ever so slightly in your favor, and you're still contributing to the overall global Tyranid war effort. Your opponent either has to pay to replace those units, or they can't, or they simply choose not to. But no matter the case, you nevertheless do stand to benefit potentially tremendously regardless. And, of course, if you do happen to be forced into, or simply choose to be deliberately facing an actual battle with your Blazing Zoanthrope, it's definitely worth considering that this damaging reaction is resolved prior to any ranged skirmish, let alone traditional combat round, taking place. So, certainly keep in mind that with 1 attack and 4 hit points, the Zoanthrope itself isn't a particularly formidable combat presence, but it does happen to have the benefit that its attack is an entirely separate source of damage from its reaction. So in that sense, it's entirely possible you could potentially force an opponent to spend 2 shield cards in order to prevent incurring any damage from the Zoanthrope whatsoever. So, while it can't affect tokens, synapse, or warlord units with its ability, it's nevertheless possible that this unit could hit one target for a total of 3 damage prior to the end of the first round of combat. And, as one final note, I'll just mention that the mobile keyword happens to occur prior to any other ability or reaction at the beginning of the combat phase, so any such unit will have the option of escaping the telepathic attacks of the Blazing Zoanthrope prior to your opportunity to trigger this reaction. Still, definitely a compelling start, albeit perhaps not the most durable nor survivable. And as we continue to cover Synapse units, keep in mind that unlike Warlords, they follow the same rules for retreating as does any other unit. But our second Synapse unit happens to be the Gravid Tervigon, which provides yet another means for the Termagant token-favoring Tyranid player to potentially fill planets with a stockpile of those aforementioned tokens, up to, but never exceeding the limit of 10. It has 1 command icon, 0 attack value, and 4 total hit points. It also has the Creature, Kraken, and Elite traits, as well as Reaction. After this unit commits to a planet, put 1 Termagant token into play at this planet. If this planet is infested, put 2 Termagant tokens into play at this planet instead. So, once again, the benefit of planetary infestation is present within this Synapse unit as well, and certainly just how many card effects you include in your deck that happen to take advantage of infestation tokens is going to play a critical role in just how many cards you should ultimately choose to include, which do deposit those potentially crucial infestation tokens upon important, pivotal, or simply just relevant planets. But in looking at this unit statistics, I think it's going to be very important to use this Synapse unit creature in a way that allows you to snipe command struggles and then let it sit safely at that planet uninvolved in combat or any actual fighting until it can safely return to your headquarters at the end of the combat phase. It's almost always good to put Termagant tokens into play, and of course, if you happen to be able to commit it to an infested planet, then putting 2 into play instead of 1 is all the better. You just don't want to be too obvious to your opponent about where you're going to be sending your Tervagon each and every round, lest it be ultimately ambushed and destroyed. So, in that sense, I think it's probably ideal to send the Tervagon to planets where you can either set up for future battles, or perhaps simply where you already have hive mind army units that can augment your newly generated tokens, or to a place where you simply already happen to have powerful Tyranid units. Whatever the case happens to be, seeing as how those lowly Termagant tokens fuel just so much of the Tyranid faction synergy, it's going to be of paramount importance that you keep the Tervagon alive for as long as possible, so that you can keep accruing tokens and always be replenishing your established Termagant army. Considering that they're not only capable of becoming formidable combatants, but that they're also used to essentially pay for or unlock a host of different Tyranid card effects, the ability to put up to 4 of them into play each round, simply by the merit of your choosing to play the Swarmlord and Gravid Tervagon, could potentially be a not only fun, not just entertaining, but also, in all likelihood, potentially rather effective Warlord and Synapse unit combination indeed. But next up, we have the first Synapse unit ever to be spoiled in the Savage Warrior Prime, a 2-attack, 5-hit point creature Leviathan Elite, with the text, "This unit must commit to a different planet than your Warlord if able. While checking for a battle and determining initiative at this planet, this unit is considered to be a Warlord unless an enemy Warlord is present at this planet." So, whereas the Gravid Tervagon could win command struggles for you but couldn't kill any present enemy units, the Savage Warrior Prime instead very much serves to function like a second Warlord itself. And in that sense, it's entirely possible that in the early game, you could combine him with either Warlord in order to potentially kill off not just 1, but 2 enemy command icon-laden units that might otherwise, over the course of the game, accrue their controller any number of additional cards and bonus resources. The only shame, though, is that without any command icons of his own, he doesn't actually deny your opponent's unit present at that planet the initial command struggle victory, because, unlike a Warlord, Synapse units do not win command merely by default. And plus, seeing as how the ever-popular 2 command icon granting Tyranid eligible neutral attachment promotion is restricted to only being affixed to army units specifically, all this taken together results in the Savage Warrior Prime being a very interesting Synapse unit during the command phase indeed. Lots of upsides to be sure, but also some significant and very exploitable weaknesses. But In any case, it's definitely worth noting that by merit of it being able to elicit additional battles each and every round of the game, it can potentially strike at your opponent early and often in order to expose and continually exploit and harass their areas of weakness. And if you happen to distribute your forces carefully, perhaps split between your warlord and this synapse unit, it's entirely possible that a good Tyranid player could launch effective, even devastating two-pronged assaults against an opponent in order to force them to either deploy their forces suboptimally, split between several worlds, or otherwise, you could simply deal just enough additional damage incidentally, incrementally, here and there through attrition in order to whittle away at your opponent's army and to set up for an inevitable late-game victory through the constant and incessant harassment of your foe. For all these reasons and more, I think that the Savage Warrior Prime can lend itself either to an aggressive playstyle or perhaps a more control-focused build rather well indeed, and I'm very excited to see just how players opt to run this very intriguing Synapse unit. I just think it's going to be extremely important, considering that he must always trigger a battle at whatever planet he ends up commit to, that he doesn't ultimately end up biting off more than he can chew. 2 attack value is significant for sure, but it isn't huge by any means when he's simply by himself, and for better or worse, the Savage Warrior Prime is not eligible to receive the help of any Tyranid faction attachments. Plus, with 5 hit points, that's significant again, but he's far from invulnerable, so I would definitely recommend that once you're past the initial round or 2 of the game, you should definitely and strongly consider providing backup for this particular Synapse unit. Still, in moving right along, our next contender for Select Synapse unit is the Stalking Lictor, with a very significant 2 command icons, 1 point of attack value, and yet another instance of 4 hit points. It possesses the Creature, Behemoth, and Elite traits with no game-relevant text. So, if you're looking for a Synapse unit to snipe command struggles, even though the Lictor isn't able to dispatch any enemy units, it's nevertheless readily able to overwhelm and potentially overcome, at the very least match, most command phase opposition, particularly during the early game. So remember again that you always enter the command phase and set your command dial, knowing exactly what your opponent has laid out on the table in front of you. You could either commit your Lictor to a planet and win a command struggle against a single icon unit, or instead you could otherwise opt to force a tie with an expensive opposing 2 icon unit. And, of course, depending entirely upon your choice of Synapse unit, your opponent will be forced to remain ever mindful of exactly what kind of devious tricks and dastardly surprises you might be able to leverage against them. So, if you can maybe encourage your opponent to make sub-optimal deployments, or perhaps commit their warlord in a less than ideal sense, strictly so they can prevent you from effectively sniping command struggles, using all that information in your favor, and proceeding to manipulate your opponent accordingly through playing mind games whenever possible, that could prove to be a more powerful than weapon something along the lines of the 2-attack Savage Warrior Prime might ever hope to be able to provide you. It's just, again, definitely worth noting that, if forced into a combat, the Stalking Lictor is definitely going to need some support, despite its ability to survive an initial, incidental, or otherwise deliberate harassment from the enemy warlord or potentially small attack value army units. So, although the effect of this Synapse unit is indeed rather subtle, it nevertheless does strike me as a very strong choice indeed, regardless of your chosen warlord. But still, last and most certainly not least, we have the Venomthrope Polluter, which has one command icon, an attack value of 1, and again a by now reasonable 4 hit points. It has the Creature, Behemoth, and Elite traits, as well as Reaction. After this unit commits to a planet, move a non-warlord unit you control from the planet with your warlord to this planet. So, despite the established Synapse unit's specific shortcomings in combat, it nevertheless can win or at least tie command struggles for you, but perhaps much more importantly, it can also allow you the rather unique ability to strategically relocate some of your most important army or even token units. I think it's of critical importance to consider that, prior to actually triggering this optional reaction, you get to see exactly where your enemy has decided to commit their warlord, and with that information in mind, you can then make the best, most informed decision possible. It can pull units away from planets where they were ultimately doomed to be destroyed by ranged or initiative-possessing attackers, or if some of your own units happen to arrive at a planet alongside your warlord, only to become immediately exhausted and remain essentially worthless and left fully exposed and vulnerable during at least the first round of combat, you can trigger this ability to whisk them away to not only safety, but to be set up so that they can enter combat entirely ready during the battles of subsequent rounds. It can allow you to place immense amounts of pressure on the first planet with expensive elite Tyranid units without needing to worry quite so much about their being sucked away upon that planet leaving play or being captured, only to be later exposed in committing to a new planet alongside your warlord. And it can also allow you to deploy a unit to the first planet in order to dodge a planet-scouring exterminatus, only to, during the command phase, shift that potentially expensive and valuable unit to exactly where you need it most, now that it's safely managed to dodge that extraordinarily threatening Space Marines event. It also allows you the rather unique opportunity, once you've seen exactly where the enemy warlord has been committed, to potentially shift some of your command icon units about the board to the location of the Venomthrope Polluter, so that if you are going to lose or break even during that command struggle, perhaps if you correct ever so slightly for your erroneous deployment, you can ultimately guarantee that you may end up winning that additional command struggle as well. It also goes almost without saying that it's a great opportunity to relocate one of your otherwise unused hive mind specialization units too, unless your opponent plays some nasty surprises on you, precisely the location you need it the most. The only qualifier here, of course, is that the Venomthrope Polluter itself can only pull units to its planet. So if you happen to be caught off guard by your opponent sending their warlords somewhere you weren't expecting, you're only able to draw units in. And although you could also use this Synapse unit as a means of manipulating initiative and or your own ranged units into making a battle at the Venomthrope's location suddenly favorable for you, such as pulling in a ranged attacker when you don't have battle initiative, or otherwise a powerful combatant if you do, it's certainly not a flawless ability by any means, but considering that yet another use would be surprising your opponent with plays such as shifting an elite unit to an infested planet where it may suddenly gain some kind of devastating ability, for instance, as could well be the case with an elite called the Shrieking Harpy that we'll be covering a little later in this video, The tricks you can pull off with this Synapse unit could be absolutely maddening indeed, and very much take your opponent by surprise. As we someday see the widespread retail release of our initial first Tyranid box set, I definitely think that though this Synapse unit may not be for everyone, and most certainly not perhaps for beginners to Conquest, I nevertheless do think that a particularly clever or masterful Tyranid player will definitely be able to pull off some spectacularly nasty tricks and effects through this Synapse unit indeed. So, now that we've moved beyond our warlords and have introduced each of our first 5 Synapse units onto the cards that constitute the bread and butter of the Swarmlord player's arsenal in particular, the non-signature Hive Mind specialization units. First up, we have the Strangler Brood, which, for a cost of 1, has no command icons, 1 point of attack value, and, for its cost, a respectable 2 hit points. It has the Creature and Leviathan traits and the Hive Mind ability. Each Termagant token you control at this planet gains +1 attack. So, for an exceptionally small resource investment, this fragile and vulnerable, very high target priority Tyranid army unit can nevertheless prove to be absolutely invaluable in providing a potentially tremendous amount of attack power to any number of present Termagant tokens. Because it's just so valuable, however, it's all the more likely to be targeted by the likes of a routing event such as Archon's Terror, and owing to its susceptibility to various damaging card effects, such as the X-damage chaos event Tzeentch's Firestorm, it's probably best kept in the relative safety of your hand until the very moment it'll provide the absolute most benefit to you, especially considering it has no command value, unless, of course, you happen to find yourself going up against the likes of a discard-happy Dark Eldar player. And, of course, if you can play multiple copies of this unit, and particularly if you manage to grant your Termagant tokens the ranged keyword, the combined synergistic results can be absolutely devastating and game-changing. Still, given just how fragile these units are, I think it's nevertheless of paramount importance you leave at least some shield cards in your hand specifically for these units, or otherwise rely on any number of other alternatives we've yet to discuss and already have in order to preserve its life, such as the Swarmlord's Leviathan Hive ship, which can return it or any other under 4 cost Hive Mind specialization unit to the battlefield after its initial destruction, or, as we'll cover in just a matter of minutes, the Adamant Hive Guard army unit, which can itself serve instead to essentially interject itself between any Hive Mind unit and incoming damage of almost any kind. Next, yet another nearly invaluable Hive Mind specialization unit, we have the Termagant Spikers, with a cost of 3, no command icons, a single point of attack value, and a much more reasonable pool of 3 hit points. It has the Creature, Behemoth, and Termagant traits, as well as the ranged keyword. In addition to the Hive Mind ability, each Termagant token you control at this planet gains range. So, although it quite clearly isn't accomplishing much on its own, it nevertheless does happen to inherently possess ranged, which, if you choose to supplement or augment this army unit with several different Tyranid attachment options, that could potentially pose a bit of a threat. And, despite its possessing the Termagant trait, it's of the utmost importance to remember that each and every Hive Mind specialization effect only ever influences and alters Termagant tokens, never army units. Still, most important of all, this rather expensive unit happens to confer each and every Termagant token at its planet that ranged keyword, which, particularly if supplemented and complemented with any other number of hive mind benefits, can allow those tokens to immediately become extraordinarily effective in combat. Not only do all of your tokens suddenly attack for 1 during the ranged skirmish round, potentially allowing you the opportunity to clear out the most dangerous opposing enemy units, but for every present copy of Strangler Brood, they also gain an additional additive point of attack power, and if you instead opt to run 1 or more copies of the albeit enormously expensive and yet to be thoroughly discussed Biovore Spore Launcher, each token can eschew their traditional attack in order to instead launch an additive area effect 1 or more volley at your enemy during that ranged skirmish round, potentially prior to your opponent having any opportunity to attack you in return. Certainly, as with any hive mind specialization unit, the Termagant Spikers are likely to be the target of your opponent's card effects such as Deception, the 2-cost Tau event which bounces non-elite units back to their controller's hand, but unless your opponent happens to have ranged attackers of their own, once the ranged skirmish has passed you by, it doesn't pose nearly the same priority target to your enemy as does something along the lines of the Strangler Brood. But if it just so happens that you've grown sick and tired of your opponent destroying your vulnerable, fragile Termagant tokens that are, unfortunately, tragically, enormously susceptible to area effect and global sources of damage, like the planet-scouring 2 damage to all units without attachments chaos event Warp Storm, then look no further than our next and last Leviathan Hive ship targetable Hive Mind specialization unit, the Swarm Guard. With a cost of 3, it does happen to possess a single command icon, a by now familiar attack value of 1, but breaking the mold entirely, a whopping 5 hit points. It has the creature and Leviathan traits, and the Hive Mind ability, each Termagant token you control at this planet gets +2 HP. So, considering that the ability of this unit is also indeed additive, if it just so happens that you have 3 copies of this unit present at any one planet, each and every Termagant token you control will have an incredible 7 hit points, and given that the Swarm Guard itself has 5, it's rather unlikely to be easily destroyed by your opponent. Unless, perhaps, they happen to possess some truly fearsome attacker, and even if they do, unless your opponent happens to have area effect of 5 or more in a single shot, then by merit of their opting to spend a combat action to attack your Swarm Guard, you're potentially buying your army all the more time to potentially take out the utmost dangerous, potentially area effect augmented of your enemy and opposing army units. All the same, I think it's going to be critically important to consider that if, as the result of all that additional HP, you ever happen to become arrogant or complacent and stop using shield cards to mitigate or prevent incoming damage to your tokens, if your opponent waits until the absolute most opportune moment to do so, perhaps if they follow up a small area effect attack by suddenly playing an event to rout, or they otherwise destroy your Swarm Guard, maybe through the likes of an Archon's Terror, or perhaps instead from damaging it and then ambushing into play a Klavex War Leader that serves to destroy that Hive Mind unit outright, once any Termagant token happens to have damage tokens, equal to its hit points, it is immediately destroyed. So I can easily see the likes of a Warp Storm followed up by an Archon's Terror being absolutely devastating. All of your Termagant tokens are sufficiently softened up so that once your Swarm Guard vanishes and they lose that +2 HP Hive Mind bonus, all of them are immediately effectively destroyed. And of course, it's definitely worth keeping in mind that even with a huge amount of hit points, those 1 attack value tokens, unless augmented by the likes of a Strangler Brood or any number of other combat bolstering effects, they still may simply ultimately not amount to much. But nevertheless, I do think that the Swarm Guard is a very potent tool for any Termagant-heavy army, and considering just how durable it itself happens to be, and that it does happen to have a command presence, it seems like yet another absolute staple in any token-heavy Tyranid, particularly Swarmlord, deck. Our next unit doesn't actually happen to have the Hive Mind specialization, but similar to the Swarm Guard, it very much fulfills a protective role. So, with our resource costs ever escalating, our next card is the Adamant Hive Guard. With a cost of 4, no command icons, an attack value of 2, and another example of 5 hit points. It has the creature and behemoth traits, as well as reaction. After a unit with the Hive Mind specialization or Termagant token at this planet is assigned damage, reassign all of that damage to this unit instead. So, although expensive, it nevertheless does have a not insignificant attack value, and without even bothering to take its ability into consideration, has a very healthy pool of HP. But where it really shines, and the reason to bother including it in a deck in the first place, is that it could prove absolutely invaluable in effectively interjecting itself between any Hive Mind specialization unit and almost any incoming source of damage. Although you aren't able to relocate damage moved to your Hive Mind units, you can absorb direct damage directed toward your attack power conferring Strangler Brood from the likes of a Rotten Plague Bearers, or instead, you can reassign all the damage from an even Armorbane keyword attack directed at a Swarm Guard. Or, still further, as a third example, if your opponent launches an Area Effect 1 volley against, say, 4 of your other units, you could simply reassign each and every individual instance of damage from those units to your Adamant Hive Guard instead. It's therefore very important to note that when it comes to that reassignment of damage, you can trigger the reaction as many times as you would like during a given round, so long as the Adamant Hive Guard remains alive to keep absorbing damage. But also, do keep in mind that any reassigned damage is always all or none. For instance, if an Ultramarines Dreadnought attacks your Termagant Spikers for 8, if the Adamant Hive Guard has even a single hit point remaining, it can nevertheless sponge up each and every point. All 8 reassigned damage tokens from that attack are moved to your Hive Guard. In fact, it has to, if you choose to activate its ability. There's no option whatsoever to split that damage between different units. Unlike the Orcish support custom field generator, you have no option whatsoever of splitting that assigned damage between any number of present Tyranid units. And, considering just how important and unfortunately fragile some of your Hive Mind units can be, although the Hive Guard's statistical distribution isn't exactly awe-inspiring, its deck inclusion, if you're running Termagant heavy, seems nevertheless almost all but mandatory. But Moving right along, we have our final hive mind unit and the first of our Tyranid elite forces in the aforementioned Biovore Spore Launcher. It has a staggering cost of 6 with not but a single command icon. It has an attack value of 3 as well as a sum of 6 hit points. It possesses the Creature, Leviathan, and Elite traits as well as Area Effect 1. But importantly, it also happens to have the Hive Mind ability. Each Termagant token you control at this planet gains Area Effect 1. So, although paying 6 resources for a mere Area Effect value of 1 printed upon this card seems like it would provide an absolutely horrid return on investment, particularly considering that other factions have access to units along the lines of the Tactical Squad Cardenas or the Cabalite Strike Force, which each, for their represented faction, happen to possess the exact same keyword and associated value, Area Effect 1, but for only a staggering third of the cost. It's therefore critically important that you always consider, when it comes to contemplating popping this card into your deck, that this does serve to grant the Area Effect 1 ability to each and every Termagant token you control present at that planet, and if stacked with the Termagant Spikers, it's entirely possible that you could, under the absolute ideal circumstances, have up to 10 Termagants each attacking with an Area Effect 1 volley during the range skirmish round, prior to your opponent having any chance to attack back in kind. Importantly, though, is that this unit does count as an elite and is therefore immune to the return-to-hand effect of an event like Deception that I mentioned earlier. Still, it's nevertheless enormously susceptible yet again to the much maligned Archon's Terror and Klavex Warleader Dark Eldar cards. Still, it's nevertheless worth noting that, just as I mentioned before for each of our Synapse units, that you're likely to have multiple copies of Fallback included in your deck, if it just so happens that you think the Biovore Spore Launcher is worth resurrection, if it happens to be destroyed, so that's definitely worth keeping in mind as an option. But if your opponent can't use nasty abilities to work around you, such as shifting the location of this or any other important hive mind specialization unit through the likes of Captain Cato Sicarius's own Sicarius's Chosen, this elite army unit is rather unlikely to die during combat, owing specifically to that huge pool of hit points, at least before you could potentially derive the maximum benefit from its ability. And even if you can't obliterate your opponent's army right out the gate through area effect, whether or not it takes place at ranged, I think if you can manage to at least clear out some of your opponent's side of the planet, whether it's in the form of army or token units, that could most assuredly help to at least tilt the odds ever so slightly, but even dramatically in your favor, if you can start to eventually, over the course of battle, guarantee that at some point you can possess or can otherwise establish the power and strength behind overwhelming numbers. Plus, it's definitely worth considering that with an attack value of 3, this unit hits rather hard in and of itself, so perhaps once your hopefully ranged tokens have cleared out or otherwise softened up the opposition, you can then simply focus on units like this one dealing much heavier, more individually daunting blows in order to quite possibly crack open even the most resilient aspects of the enemy army opposing you. So, while we'll certainly cover several other Tyranid elite options later on, the Biovore Spore Launcher is definitely worth considering, if it just so happens that you're running a Termagant-heavy deck, and regardless of which Hive Mind units you choose, I think that thus far each and every one certainly presents a number of intriguing and compelling options for just how exactly to augment your established and standing Termagant army. So, as a final note, I'll just mention that, perhaps if you ever find yourself with a tremendous abundance of resources, or otherwise opt to elicit multiple triggers of the put any unit into play planet Yavvarn, multiple copies of Biovore Spore Launcher present at the same planet, albeit very unlikely, do end up conferring yet another instance of an additive effect, so that Area Effect 1 suddenly, if 2 Biovores are present, becomes Area Effect 2, and 3 Biovores in turn happens to confer an almighty, very frightening Area Effect 3 to each and every Termagant token you happen to have sitting at that planet. But now that we've covered our box set swath of Hive Mind units, let's take a look at a trio of additional token-relevant creatures, starting with the Termagant Sentry. With a cost of 1, it has a single command icon, an attack value of 1, and 2 hit points, leaving it ever so slightly less likely than a baseline Termagant token to succumb to death by devious enemy card effects. It has the Creature, Kraken, and Termagant traits, as well as Reaction. After a Termagant token you control is destroyed at this planet, ready this unit. So, first and foremost, I definitely think that many Tyranid players are likely to play this unit for its command presence alone. One resource to potentially win a command struggle is a very respectable value indeed, and at the very least, it can allow you some ability to keep pace with your opponent, littering the board with the likes of resource and card generating neutral, non-Tyranid eligible rogue traders and void pirates. Plus, having a pool of 2 hit points means that it could even survive an attempted snipe from the likes of a 1 attack value warlord such as Eldorath Starbane or Commander Shadowsun, and if forced into a battle, seeing as how it's going to be a very low priority target under almost any circumstance, so long as you can manage to have it attack, it can potentially ready each and every time a Termagant token at its planet leaves play with no limit at all. The problem, though, is that if it is one of the more dangerous you have present, it's likely to be almost immediately destroyed by your opponent, or if you have a significant number of Hive Mind units present at that planet to augment your Termagant tokens into becoming frightening combatants, then in that case, you're rather unlikely to want to spend your first several combat turns on such a weak, middling at best attacker in the first place. It seems like attacking with this unit is almost an action of utter last resort under all but the most unusual of circumstances. Perhaps the best combat use for this card is simply arriving alongside your warlord from your HQ, only later to be readied when a Termagant token happens to leave play, and in that case, although it's perhaps only contributing a single measly point of damage at the end of combat, it nevertheless is doing something, and depending on which planet it happens to be commit to, it might ultimately end up sitting there and helping you during the following round's command phase. But even in the situation where it is showing up to combat exhausted, seeing as how it is relatively easy for it to become readied again, in many cases it's fairly likely to be doing at least a little bit more for you than would some other far more powerful, far more expensive unit that's nevertheless doesn't happen to possess that same readying ability. But in all honesty, considering its cost, and seeing as how it does happen to have one command icon beyond everything else, I think this somewhat underwhelming card is nevertheless rather powerful given its exceptionally affordable price. For only a single resource token, I definitely think players should expect to be blown away, but given exactly what you're paying for, this army unit certainly strikes me as worth it. But next up we have perhaps one of my personal favorite units in the 3-cost Termagant Horde, which has one command icon, an attack value of 1, and 3 hit points. It has the creature, Leviathan, and Termagant traits, as well as reaction. After a combat round at this planet begins, put 1 Termagant token into play at this planet. So, what's particularly exciting to me about this card are the possibilities, in that so long as you can prolong any given battle, at the beginning of each and every combat round, for each and every copy of Termagant Horde you happen to have at that planet, you generate an additional, potentially powerful, and at the very least likely to be aggravating, Termagant token, which can then not only serve to attack, but can also perhaps be later spent to fuel a number of other powerful Tyranid card effects. This non-unique army unit functions rather similarly to the Orc Warlord Old Zogwart, in that the longer a battle lasts, the more fearsome it ultimately becomes, and through the relentless power of attrition, so long as you can manage to keep this army unit alive, you can potentially dish out enormous amounts of damage to your opponent if they choose to prioritize their targets incorrectly. Certainly this unit by itself isn't particularly fearsome, but it's definitely meant to augment an army, as opposed to building one from scratch. But if you happen to have a handful of shield cards, perhaps if your opponent is trying to snipe this unit with their warlord, and their warlord alone in particular, if you can trick them into overcommitting, the number of Termagant tokens you can, as a result, accumulate, and the number of damage tokens you can dish out, can become very significant very quickly. And I think it's critically important to consider, too, that unlike Old Zogwart, any tokens generated by this unit are completely permanent additions to your standing armed forces up until the point your opponent manages to ultimately deal with them. That is, if they manage to deal with them. It's also worth noting that this reaction occurs at the beginning of a combat round, which means that those Termagant tokens are created after an opponent's gleeful Plague Beast may have had its opportunity to destroy them at the initial onset of the combat phase. So for all the reasons I've already mentioned, and many more aside, I'm, at least theoretically, exceptionally fond of the Termagant Horde. Even the fact that it forces your opponent to make hard decisions about exactly which targets to focus their fire upon during combat, I think there are just too many good things to say about the possibilities when it comes to this unit. I love being able to present your opponent with as many opportunities to make mistakes as I can, and this provides those in spades. And while it certainly makes a fantastic candidate for the likes of an Archon's Terror, or Deception, or Clivex War Leader, or any number of other enormously frustrating effects, if your opponent expends those cards in order to destroy this unit, then you can at the very least rest ever so slightly more secure in knowing that they have one fewer copy of any of those with which to use against the remainder of your army. And last but most certainly not least of this somewhat arbitrarily grouped trio, we have the event Spawn Termagants, which, for a cost of 2, also happens to possess one shield icon as well as the power trait. It reads Deploy Action. Put one Termagant token into play at each planet. So, although for a not insignificant cost, it can nevertheless effectively flood the board with Termagant tokens, and particularly if you're running the likes of a Savage Warrior Prime as your chosen Synapse unit, and triggering a grand maximum of 4 battles each round, depending on where you and your opponent decide to commit your Warlords and your Synapse unit, of course. Having Termagants anywhere and everywhere around the tabletop to supplement your standing army could make anything between a trivial to a potentially monumental difference as to the outcome of the command and combat phases of not just that round, but each and every additional round of the game, so long as those tokens end up remaining in play. But, of course, the effectiveness of those tokens does depend entirely upon what other units you and your opponent have and where. If your opponent possesses the initiative token or the ranged keyword and can trigger an area effect volley prior to your option of doing anything at all, maybe this ultimately won't make any difference at all in your playing this event prior to combat. But if the situation is different, and particularly if you have a plethora of different hive mind units to supplement, augment, and complement your attacking Termagants for a rather affordable value inherent to this event, you could potentially make a tremendous difference as to the outcome of one or more combats each round. Or perhaps if you're opting to run the Swarm Lord as your chosen warlord, along with the Brood Warriors that constitute his associated signature army unit, one or more copies of that card, carefully and strategically positioned about the various planets which compose the game board and layout of the Traxxas sector, that combo could very well result in either your winning a huge number of command struggles, netting a giant influx of cards and resource tokens, or hopefully, at the very least, serving to break even with your opponent, tying and denying him or her what would have otherwise been command struggle victories won by your opponent. So, the value of Spawn Termagants will certainly vary dramatically from even moment to moment and play to play, but keeping always in mind that for later, as of yet undiscussed in this video Tyranid cards, that Termagant tokens are often enough used to fund and literally pay for various other card effects, Spawn Termagants could ultimately prove to not just be invaluable in the right deck, but further still, an absolute bargain for the cost, and versatile to boot. Still, I think that with this event, without overcomplicating things, it can ultimately quite simply boil down to the fact that extra bodies on the battlefield are seldom an unwelcome and unwanted thing, and unless your opponent stands to directly benefit from being able to destroy additional units of yours, even a few additional points of damage here and there, an extra shield card or two spent by your opponent, or perhaps even some additional attacks directed toward you being effectively wasted on these newly generated tokens and serving to perhaps spare some of your more permanently valuable army units by the merit of your playing this event, Any or all of those situations, either individually or instead taken all together, could easily and immediately amount to making this event readily worth its printed price of admission. So I definitely encourage players to experiment and practice with this card. Once we eventually see our Great Devourer retail release, and of course, be sure to report back and let me know just how your actual, genuine tabletop experience in playing our Tyranid faction and this event specifically did end up going for you. But moving ever on, next we have a few units to help establish the Tyranid player's command presence, starting with the Ripper Swarm. It costs no resource tokens whatsoever, but does possess a command icon regardless. With 1 attack value and a single hit point, it has the creature trait, and is one of scarcely few Tyranid cards with the limited keyword. So there isn't that much to say about this unit, apart from my very much recommending you run at least several copies in almost any, if not literally every, Tyranid faction deck. But, considering that Tyranid players can run the neutral attachment promotion, make sure to remain ever mindful about just how many other limited Tyranid and neutral cards you do happen to ultimately include in your deck. So, this unit is certainly vulnerable to destruction through any number of incidental sources of damage, but seeing as how it could let you win command struggles for no more than the mere cost of the very card that Ripper Swarm is printed upon, it still seems like an absolute bargain. I'd suggest waiting likely until the end of the deploy phase to play it whenever possible, and to definitely be mindful of your opponent's warlord attempting to snipe it, but if you happen to deploy it at a low priority planet, perhaps especially one with an unexciting battle ability, then it may prove relatively safe from assassination after all. So definitely play this unit. And if you'd rather not wait until the end of the deploy phase to play it, then you could also use it as yet another means of starving your opponent of deploy actions. So, not only in the lore does the Ripper Swarm serve a fundamental, integral purpose in any Tyranid invasion fleet, but seeing as how it's definitely pretty decent in Conquest as well, I think, simply put, under almost any circumstance, you certainly want to find a way to slot this card into at least your first few Tyranid decks. So, next up, what's sure to be another Tyranid command staple, we have the Toxic Venomthrope. With a cost of 2, a sizable 2 command icons, an attack value of 0, and 2 hit points. It has the creature and kraken traits, as well as the reaction: after you win a command struggle at this planet, infest it. If it was already infested, either gain 1 resource token or draw 1 card instead of infesting it. So, earlier we saw that our Gravid Tervigon generated an additional Termagant token at a planet if it happened to be infested, and the Toxic Venomthrope is thus far the very first card we've covered capable of infesting planets. Plus, if it just so happens that you've already infested that planet, whether it was the Venomthrope itself having done that during a previous game round, or if it was otherwise through any number of other card effects, functioning similarly to a Rogue Trader and Void Pirate, you can simply opt, if that planet's already infested, to instead pick to accrue either an additional card or additional resource as a command struggle victory bonus, whichever it is that will serve to benefit you the most at the time of your winning that struggle. Maybe you need to dig through your deck for additional events or shield cards going into the combat phase, or perhaps you need extra resources to fund mid-combat events and surprises to leverage against your opponent, but either way, whichever the case may be, the ability to choose can often be very powerful itself, so it's hard to go wrong with a 2 command icon unit for 2 resources, and as the Tyranid command presence isn't overwhelmingly powerful given our current card pool, I definitely think that this warrants inclusion in almost any Tyranid deck. It's doing effectively nothing during combat, granted, but it can survive incidental damage nevertheless, and regardless, generating additional cards and income in Conquest is absolutely invaluable. Plus, as we still have many more Tyranid cards left to cover, being able to infest a planet prior to the combat phase, so that it does indeed possess an infestation token during the combat phase, can allow you access to a wide range of different surprises and nasty, devious card effects with which to use against, and quite likely surprise, all but the most astute and perceptive of opponents. So, adopting the role of providing the more expensive end of our Tyranid command unit spectrum, last we have the Tyranid Warrior, a rather vanilla but perhaps therefore quite versatile army unit with a cost of 3, but 2 command icons, an attack value of 2, and a relatively sizable pool of 4 hit points. It has the creature and behemoth traits, and no game-relevant text. So, beyond being a rather respectable platform for augmentation through the likes of Tyranid biomorph attachments, for a cost of 3, it does provide fairly reasonable value in a command phase sense. It's not quite the same bargain as the 2-for-2 Toxic Venomthrope, but for an additional resource token, it's a far more formidable combatant and all but immune to enemy warlord sniping and assassination. Even a Talisarian Tempest Blade wielding Captain Cato Sicarius, attacking for 3 with Armor Bane, cannot fell this Tyranid in but a single blow. So not only do you get an opportunity in that instance to return fire, but then you also get the chance to retreat safely away in order to preserve the life of this far from inexpensive army unit and to deprive Sicarius of yet another resource token. So, given that you're likely to run at least a couple copies of this unit, I think you should definitely deploy it where it'll make the most command sense and difference for you relative to the position of your opponent's forces. And once it's on the tabletop, I think you can rest reasonably safe in knowing it's fairly unlikely that your opponent will dispatch it without having to invest at least a little effort in the form of one or more than just their warlord type card effects. So, now that we've seen one unit that benefits from infestation and another unit that can incidentally function to generate infestation tokens, on to a trio of additional infestation eliciting Tyranid cards. The first of which is the exceptionally simple Predation, a 0-cost event with the flexibility of 1 shield icon, as well as the tactic trait and the text action. Infest a planet adjacent to an infested planet. So, if it just so happens that somewhere out there on the battlefield you already happen to possess a somehow infested planet, you can simply add an infestation token to the adjacent planet of your choice. And keeping in mind that the only way to remove infestation tokens is by merit of that planet leaving play, either by being captured or simply having the first planet remain uncontested and disappearing unclaimed, or by having a non-Tyranid opponent win a battle at a planet. Once you do happen to have one of those tokens in play, this allows you to continue to spread those infestation tokens with utterly trivial difficulty, and as we eventually start to cover an ever-increasing number of rather compelling reasons to achieve and maintain planetary infestations, although this event may not seem like it's doing much, and may ultimately not warrant inclusion in your deck, if you do happen to find enough infestation-favoring card effects worth using to you, then this event definitely warrants at least a little consideration. But next up is a card that does at least a little bit more for you in a more concrete and immediate sense, and definitely packs an ever so slightly greater staying presence in the form of the Scything Hormagaunts. For a cost of 2, they have a single command icon, 2 attack and 2 HP, in addition to the creature and Leviathan traits, and further they read action. After you deploy this unit, infest this planet. So, if you're looking for a guaranteed means of initiating an infestation, look no further than this army unit. We'll cover a few different cards that benefit from planetary infestation during the deploy phase before too long, so this could be a spectacular way to start off your deployment, especially considering that the only time your opponent will ever be able to remove an infestation token, at least in the context of our current card pool, is during the combat phase. So, with that statistical distribution, it's hard to go wrong. It's reasonably durable, has some command value, and hits relatively hard. For all those reasons and more, it's not an exhilarating deck inclusion by any means, but it certainly makes a lot of fundamental Tyranid sense, and definitely strikes me as a strong, basic contender for inclusion in most typical Tyranid decks. And the last of our infestation trio, we also have the Virulent Spore Sacs. At a cost of 2, they have 1 command icon, 0 attack value, and a single hit point. They have the creature and drone traits, and the text combat action. Sacrifice this unit to deal 1 damage to each enemy unit at this planet, and infest this planet. So, while an investment of 2 resource tokens and a card may seem like a lot for a mere area effect 1 type ability, by merit of this effect being a combat action, you nevertheless have the opportunity to trigger that detonation prior to any attacks or even range skirmish taking place. Plus, although 1 damage definitely isn't enormous, it does happen to nevertheless affect the entire present enemy army, and can provide a tremendous amount of pressure for your opponent to expend shield cards in attempt to preserve the lives of especially their relatively frail and fragile units. Even if your enemy doesn't have units in danger of being killed right then and there, a sufficient softening of any of his or her standing forces as a setup for the rest of your army could ultimately prove to nevertheless be devastating. And considering that you could potentially trigger multiple copies of these virulent spore sacs, perhaps increasingly likely toward the end of the game, you could, in all possibility or even likelihood, dish out some considerable and at times very significant and always entirely pre-battle damage indeed. Plus, beyond possessing the potential of outright eliminating enemy forces en masse, it also happens to serve the possibly potent effect of causing infestation, which can be a fantastic means of preparing yourself to unleash some manner of hellish or devastating combo of card effects against your enemy later during that phase, or simply setting yourself up for a favorable following round deploy phase. At least, that is, if you do end up winning that battle, as a loss would simply result in your suddenly gained infestation token rather abruptly disappearing again. So it definitely remains to be seen just how effective and worthy of deck inclusion the virulent spore sacs eventually prove to be, but until the Great Devourer reaches the eager and grasping hands of more than just Gen Con 2015 attendees and their luckier than the Hive Tyrant friends, we definitely won't know for certain. So now that we've discussed a few cards that cause infestation, it's time to explore why exactly you'd want to generate some of those tokens in the first place. Beyond just our Gravid Tervigon Synapse unit, which does generate additional Termagants when committed to a site of infestation, the Tyranids also have access to the unique support Digestion Pool. For a cost of 1, it has the Upgrade trait, and is our second Tyranid instance of the limited keyword. It reads Interrupt. When you deploy a Tyranid unit at an infested planet, exhaust this support to reduce that unit's cost by 2. So, for the same price tag as every other faction-specific army unit resource cost reducing support, this card does have one added restriction, but also possesses the additional benefit of decreasing cost by 2 each time it happens to be triggered, as opposed to just a cost reduction of 1, as is the case with all of those other similar supports. Of course, you have to be deploying that unit to a planet with an infestation token in order to take advantage of this effect at all, but as we've seen so far, and we still haven't covered every infestation eliciting card effect the Tyranids have access to, that isn't always exactly difficult to accomplish. And plus, considering we have cards that allow Tyranids to be relocated around the battlefield after they've been deployed, ideally at a cost reduced by 2, it's entirely possible that you might deploy a unit at one planet, only to simply, later in that round, relocate it through the likes of a Venom Throat Polluter, or perhaps an even more devious and less predictable means, such as the Hive Mind specialty unit resurrecting Swarmlord's signature support, the Leviathan Hive Ship, though of course in that instance you don't actually have any opportunity to reduce any kind of cost, seeing as how you're not actually paying to return that unit to play in the first place. But regardless, if you can manage to continually deploy units at infested planets at least once per round once you've played this support, by merit of this card reducing the cost of those units by double the amount of any other faction-specific resource reducer, it recurs its own cost far faster and is, as a direct result, a much more valuable draw because of it. It also serves to maintain its value a bit more throughout each passing game round, in that even if you've already played out several rounds of the game, not having played or even drawn this support, you could nevertheless still derive a significant benefit from playing this support, even if played perhaps during the final few rounds of a given game. Whereas each non-Tyranid iteration of this support requires requires one use to effectively pay for its resource cost, another use or two to cover the cost of it being a card, and only then does its controller actually start to see any profit. The Tyranid version here, of course, speeds through that process twice as fast, so long as you can overcome that additional restriction. As with any of those cards, of course, it's a shame that it's unique, and you certainly want to pace yourself when it comes to slotting limited cards into your deck, but with those twin deck building considerations in mind, this seems almost for certain an absolute Tyranid staple. The only question in my mind is just how many copies to include, based additionally, of course, upon how many card effects you happen to run, with the possibility or potential of infesting planets. But regardless of what you ultimately decide, next up we have what amounts to at least a conceptual favorite of mine in the Hunter Gargoyles. They have a cost of 1 and no command icon, but an attack value of 2 with a single hit point. They happen to possess the Creature and Kraken traits and combat action. Move this unit to an infested planet, limit once per phase. So, although it's yet another example of an exceptionally frail and fragile Tyranid unit, it nevertheless fits perfectly into a number of extraordinarily sneaky and devious combat tricks and combos. In a defensive sense, if you don't have the initiative, or if instead you're facing enemy ranged units, you could simply use this unit's combat action in order to let it escape off to safety, or, much more excitingly, you could use it in an offensive sense, triggering instead the combat action of one or more of your Hunter Gargoyles units once all enemy units are exhausted, so that they can attack for a value of 2 as many times as you happen to possess copies of these ready-to-fight airborne Tyranid attackers. Plus, I think it only gets all the more interesting when you start to contemplate some of the at times intricate combo possibilities. For instance, you could deploy a virulent spore sacs to one planet, and then during the command phase, commit your Venom Throat Polluter to a different planet, trigger its reaction, and pull your spore sacs, entirely unexpected, to that synapse present other planet. Then, during the combat phase, you could force your spore mine to explode, dealing out damage to the enemy army and causing the planet to immediately pick up an infestation token. And then, once conditions are at their absolute most favorable, once the opposing army is already weakened and softened up for your gargoyles to swoop in, you can proceed to opportunistically shift any number of Hunter Gargoyles to that planet if a battle is taking place, and again potentially take out your opponent's hopefully vulnerable and exposed forces. Entirely unexpected, unanticipated, and hopefully these units will prove to deliver a very nasty surprise indeed. It's definitely due to exciting possibilities like that one that inspire me to look at these gargoyles with a sense of awe, inspiration, and enthusiasm, so while I fully admit that they certainly may not ultimately prove worth putting in most, maybe even all Tyranid decks, the possibilities at least I find rather captivating. I definitely think they're worth trying, and at least for me personally, I look forward to giving them a shot in at least my first several Tyranid infestation token synergy decks. But last of our infestation benefiting trio is an example of a card that is essentially unlocked by merit of the Traxxas sector happening to possess one or more infested planets. It's the 2-cost event Spore Burst, which has 2 shield icons, the power trait, and reads deploy action. Put a unit with printed cost 3 or lower into play from your discard pile at an infested planet. So, similar to the Eldar Combat Phase Army Unit recurring event Gift of Isha, this allows a Tyranid player, during the deploy phase, to return any unit from their discard pile permanently back to play, albeit at a target infested planet. Not just the topmost unit, and very important to note, not only until the end of the phase. So, if it just so happens that there are no infestation tokens, then this event, outside of course of its significant printed shield value, is quite literally unplayable. I think this is nevertheless fantastic when used on hive mind specialization units in particular, just because in so many decks they're going to be of paramount and pinnacle importance, and whether you're returning a Strangler Brood to play in order to grant Termagant's +1 attack value, or perhaps the Swarmlord's signature Brood Warriors in order to accrue a potentially enormous number of command icons all amassed together at one planet of your choice, again, so long as it happens to possess one of those infestation tokens, there exist a potential wealth of different options available to you. Recurring a 2-command, 2-attack, 4 HP Tyranid Warrior is also a fantastic value, but really, being able to pick and choose, as opposed to being made to simply settle for whatever happens to be on top of your discard pile, is absolutely fantastic. Plus, I think it's great that if it just so happens that an important hive mind unit may have died prior to your having a Leviathan hive ship out in play, so that it could resurrect it immediately preceding its destruction, this allows you another opportunity to keep bringing that unit back into play one time per round through the exhaustion of that support for what could very well amount to the entire remainder of the game. Granted, you can only play this event during the deploy phase, and you can only target an infested planet, but it does open up a breadth of additional options to you, and given that you can recur up to 3-cost army units, seeing as how it itself only costs 2, it can even provide a bit of resource savings. So, I definitely can't think of many negatives to mention about this event. It seems like it's going to be a bit of a staple, and those 2 printed shield icons definitely give it significant inherent value regardless. So, I very much look forward to trying it out, and think that in the right situation, it could easily make an enormous difference in a game. Even if your opponent is forcing you to discard cards from your hand, if you lose some critically important Termagant token hive mind specialization combo piece, in the form of an important army unit, this could allow you a fantastic opportunity to very handily indeed sneak it back out of your discard pile and directly into play. So, although I've thus far been covering cards in convenient, similar clusters and groupings, one that doesn't exactly fit in with any other, yet still stands to be a fantastic target for Spore Burst, is the volatile Pyrovore. With a cost of 3, it has a single command icon, and a rather respectable 3 attack value. Further, it has a rather survivable pool of 3 hit points, and happens to have the Creature and Behemoth traits, in addition to the text, Interrupt, When this unit is destroyed by an attack, deal 3 damage to the attacker. So, clearly, it is of critical importance that you do not let this unit be destroyed by an effect like Warp Storm, and alas, even an area effect volley dealing a lethal blow will unfortunately not trigger this interrupt, because remember that area effect damage counts as damage from a card effect, and not damage delivered by an attack. For that reason, it makes sense to expend shield cards in a manner that essentially forces your opponent to deliver the killing blow to this unit with an attack from something valuable of their own. Or, if they simply dare not attack it, you can simply benefit from a rather significant base attack value of 3, which, relative to the Tyranid cards we've covered thus far, is exceptionally respectable indeed. So, definitely a target for routing to be sure, being bounced back to your hand, and certainly for being destroyed by the likes of a Klavex War Leader. But for all those aforementioned reasons and more, it's of paramount importance that you try your utmost best to force your opponent into essentially eating that damage when the Pyrovore's end seems near. For the cost, this seems like a totally reasonable value, and considering just how much damage it can dish out, through not just conventional means but also being destroyed, and keeping in mind just how much pressure either of those can force upon your opponent to waste valuable cards as shields, I think the Pyrovore is definitely worth a try, and by merit of its presence upon a planet alone, it can certainly discourage your opponent from sending their warlord anywhere near. So, give it a shot, combine it with recursive effects to be certain, and be sure to report back on your experience with this Tyranid unit and all of our other cards I'll cover today in that comment section below. So, although by now it's probably no more than a distant memory, as we move ever onward and start to cover our elite Tyranid forces, I happen to have mentioned earlier that certain cards stand to benefit based entirely upon how many Termagant tokens you can manage to force into being present and amassed all together upon the surface of the same planet. Well, that card has finally deep struck its way into this video in the form of the most expensive card Conquest has seen thus far, the Burrowing Trigon. With an absolutely staggering cost of 10 resources, it has a colossal 3 command icons and a tremendous 7 attack value. Still further, it happens to possess a near bottomless pool of 7 hit points, as well as the creature, behemoth, and elite traits, making this formidable, durable Tyranid army unit yet another perfectly eligible fallback recipient, as is each and every other Synapse and army unit elite. And last, but most certainly not least, this unit also happens to possess the critically important printed text, "Reduce the cost to deploy this unit by X. X is the highest number of Termagant tokens you control at a single planet." So, despite what seems at first to be an absolutely enormous and all but insurmountable resource requirement, if you do manage to amass a large number of Termagant tokens at any one individual planet, it is entirely possible that you can slash the cost of this unit considerably or dramatically. 7 attack and 7 hit points is nothing to be taken lightly, and keeping ever in mind that we've yet to cover several enormously potent Tyranid attachments, it's fully possible that you could turn this already daunting and intimidating Tyranid monster monstrous creature into an all but unstoppable battlefield killing machine. So I think that this is definitely a card that necessitates playtesting, because if you can manage to pull off the Burrowing Trygon Dream, it's essentially entirely possible that if you manage to somehow accumulate the limit of 10 Termagant tokens at any one specific planet, this almost absurdly powerful, extraordinarily versatile unit can quite literally be played 100% for free, apart from the card it's printed upon. The problem, of course, is that that situation, quite frankly, isn't very likely, but still, maybe during one round, the Swarmlord could deposit a token at one planet, and the Gravid Turvigon happens to be commit to that planet in order to immediately deposit 2 more. Or maybe a Bone Sabers wielding Swarmlord manages to amass several additional tokens during the same combat. And plus, it's definitely worth keeping in mind that yet another additional token supplement alternative might be provided in the form of your opponent allowing 1 or more copies of the army unit Termagant Hordes to erroneously go unchecked, which could most definitely result in a veritable horde of Termagant tokens being put into play. And if you're bound and determined to stack as many tokens as possible onto one individual specific planet, you could play a Termagant Swarm or 2 and attempt to strategically relocate some of those spawned token units through the likes of a Venom Throat Polluter. So certainly the options for how to attempt to reduce the cost required by the Burrowing Trygon by as many resources as possible are myriad indeed. So while it's unlikely that anyone may ever accomplish that Burrowing Trygon Dream, and if they ever do, then their opponent has more than likely let something go seriously wrong, considering that it is entirely possible to maybe end a round with 5 or more Termagant tokens, even that happen to all be located at the same planets, and perhaps even more if maybe 2 rounds manage to pass your opponent by without their whittling down or otherwise chipping away at your forces. So it is, albeit unlikely, nevertheless essentially at least possible that you could put this elite, intimidating, and fearsome Tyranid army unit into play for an absolute steal. The problem then, of course, is that, quite tragically, it's prone to each and every pitfall that plagues all the other fantastically expensive, enormously powerful elite units in this game. After incurring as much as a single point of attack damage from a Space Marine unit led by the Right Warlord, The Fury of Sicarius event may claim this monstrous creature's life in a single fell swing, and an Archon's Terror event, or Inquisitorial Fortress support, makes routing a Tyranid beast like this one away from combat utterly trivial. And of course, Klavex Warleader tears it to pieces. I could go on and on, but I won't, because I don't want to spend the rest of the day miserably depressed. It just so happens, actually, that a Trygon is the very last remaining Warhammer 40,000 tabletop miniature I happen to still have in my possession that I've personally painted, and while I love seeing a monumentally powerful card iteration of one of my favorite Tyranid monstrous creatures, it's a damn shame it's still susceptible to all those same pitfalls we see time and time again. So maybe it's worth running a single copy, perhaps it's worth it to run more if you're confident in your Termagant token preserving abilities, But in any case, I'm definitely excited to see just how well this unit does actually function when included in a token-rich Tyranid deck. After all, if your opponent ever happens to be so foolish as to trigger the battle ability of the planet Yvarn, or they otherwise afford you that opportunity, dumping a card like this one onto the table in response will not only serve as a fantastic reply to punish your opponent's error, but if it does convince your opponent or force their hand in expending any number of those aforementioned nasty, aggravating, frustrating, and maddening card effects so that they can bully, control, or outright destroy this unit, then at least, by merit of that being used up and unavailable for future play, that, in and of itself, could ultimately prove invaluable and perhaps, if you can get it into play for free or for a very affordable price indeed, could potentially make playing the Burrowing Trigon worthwhile. But in any case, the next of our elite units is the Ravenous Haruspex with, and it sounds bizarre to be saying this, a much more affordable baseline resource cost of 5. It has a single command icon, an attack value of 3, and a rather respectable 5 hit points. It has the creature, behemoth, and elite traits, as well as the reaction, after this unit destroys an enemy army unit by an attack, gain X resource tokens. X is equal to the printed cost of the destroyed unit, limit once per phase. So, it goes without saying that if your opponent has a Burrowing Trigon in play, you must ensure that you land the killing blow with your Ravenous Haruspex. It's definitely susceptible to all the different enemy card effects I have already listed, so I need not repeat myself again, but certainly consider this elite a definite contender for being a priority when it comes to your opponent spending shield cards. In that respect, it could be a great play for when your opponent doesn't have many cards remaining in hand, and especially if you've managed to previously soften up one of their large, expensive units. The problem, though, is that this game's current meta doesn't really favor playing expensive units, and although an attack value of 3 can clear out a large swath of possible enemy targets, it's not likely that you're going to be able to do something crazy like recurring the entire 5 resource cost of this elite unit with no more than a single swing. And under no circumstance should you ever overextend yourself and set yourself up to suffer a potentially catastrophic loss simply out of being greedy. Still, though, it is entirely possible for you to rake in a significant amount of resources through this elite's attacks, and if you do manage to play cleverly, strategically, and maybe have a bit of luck on your side based upon your opponent's previous deployments and plays, the amount of resource tokens you could potentially accumulate over what could amount to several game rounds could, in all possibility, be enormous. So, while I certainly don't think you'll often get this elite to function quite so well as you or I would like, if it does manage to score a kill, maybe even 2, let alone even more than that, then it could quickly prove to be worth the price of admission rather quickly. In fact, it might work very well with the Savage Warrior Prime, so that you can force an additional battle to take place, perhaps where your opponent wasn't quite expecting it, and in turn you can take advantage of picking off some situationally vulnerable enemy units. Along those same lines, being able to strategically relocate your ravenous Haruspecs through the likes of a Venom Throat Polluter, so long as you can force a battle to take place, could also provide an excellent opportunity for you to potentially accumulate some additional resource tokens. Another problem, though, is that if at any point you're using this to damage or even bloody your enemy's warlord, soften up a hardy target, kill a token unit, or if you happen to be playing a mirror match, if you're attacking a synapse unit, then even if you destroy one of those things, you aren't actually gaining any benefit at all from this ability. So definitely something for your opponent in a very real sense to be afraid of, but unfortunately entirely possible for them to work around. And because of that initial, rather immense, upfront payment on your part in order to get this unit into play, if your opponent is able to play around this Tyranid elite, the sacrifices you may have made to your command presence or army composition by sinking those 5 resources into this single unit could ultimately prove to be disastrous for you. So if you have a different opinion, please feel free to let me know, but until I get a chance to actually play test this one, though I remain hopeful and ever optimistic, I nevertheless have to remain at least a little doubtful and skeptical, at least for the moment. But regardless, next up we have yet another elite Tyranid option taking the form of the 6-cost Shrieking Harpy. It has 2 command icons, an almost laughable attack value of a mere 2, and a seemingly low 5 hit points. Also, it happens to possess the Creature, Kraken, and Elite traits, and alarmingly, the Flying keyword, which serves to immediately make it into an enormously durable army unit indeed. However, the most compelling reason to consider including this unit in your deck would definitely have to be its combat reaction, which reads, after this unit is declared as an attacker at an infested planet, exhaust each enemy non-elite army unit and token unit at this planet. So, if you can either force your opponent into fighting the Harpy at an infested planet, or you can play the Harpy and then later, hopefully unexpectedly infest that planet, perhaps by playing a Scything Hormigaunt late in the deploy phase, exploding a virulent Spore Sacs during combat, or by playing a Predation as an action once the deploy phase has passed and after your opponent has laid out their entire army. If you can attack with your Harpy and trigger that reaction, you can exhaust every single non-warlord, non-synapse, non-elite unit that your opponent happens to possess at that planet. And although an attack value of a paltry 2 isn't doing much in and of itself, considering the absurd number of enemy units that the Harpy's attack could nevertheless stand to exhaust, this ability quite literally has the potential of practically winning an entire game alone and in a single activation. By allowing your forces to run rampant over the enemy, you could easily force their warlord to retreat, you could bloody or kill their warlord, or, so long as you have sufficient time prior to your opponent having an opportunity to retreat their units, you can spend action after action pouring attack after attack into their army and potentially annihilating their entire garrison of forces. Even if your opponent has the initiative or ranged units, even if they have a staggeringly powerful attacker of their own, unless they can manage to kill a 5 hit point unit that cuts any damage from incoming attacks in half, prior to your ability to use shield cards to further mitigate that damage, then this elite could prove to be utterly disastrous for your opponent's forces. Another scenario would be to simply infest a critical planet well in advance if you know full well that you absolutely need to win that battle, and then you can simply deploy this unit at your leisure to that location so that you can absolutely brick wall your opponent and all but certainly prevent them from capturing that crucial planet. Tragically, the very same pitfalls that all elites are prone to yet again rear their ugly head in regard to this unit as well, but the possibilities are nevertheless spectacularly exciting, and particularly considering that there is nothing your opponent can do save for winning a battle at any given planet in order to remove infestation tokens. Whether you're using this in any of the ways I already mentioned, and or shifting it around the battlefield alongside your Venom Throat Polluter, there are myriad options available to you, and in the right situation, this elite can prove to be easily absolutely incredible, and if it weren't for making one enormous target all the larger, it would be a fantastic, stellar platform with which to affix any of the several different Tyranid attachments I'll be covering in mere minutes. Granted, it's very expensive, and direct damage manages to circumvent the flying keyword entirely, but the possibilities when it comes to this elite are utterly astounding, and even without any help, or even being unable to trigger its reaction, given just how durable this unit may be, it can still stand to perform some serious work for you. Just whenever possible, you certainly want to ensure that you can derive the utmost value from this and every other Tyranid unit and card you happen to include in your deck. At the very least, though, this Death Star-style unit could serve as a huge magnet for incoming enemy fire, so although it's yet another card I definitely want to see tested before I sing its praises, especially when it comes to seeing units like this one, it makes me not regret for even the barest of moments my initial decision to take up Conquest and start playing this game. And I have to admit that thus far, with many more Tyranid cards to go, it's been absolutely fantastic seeing exactly how Fantasy Flight Games and our Conquest design team has ultimately decided to realize my personal favorite Warhammer 40,000 universe faction. So, considering that we've already covered our Biovore Spore Launcher when we discussed our Hive Mind specialization units, the very last of our Tyranid Elite, and indeed our final Tyranid faction army unit to cover within the Great Devourer Deluxe box set, happens to be the rather strikingly Lovecraftian Yumgarl Gene Stealer, with a cost of 5 and a healthy 2 command icons. It has an initially underwhelming 4 attack and 4 hit points, with the creature, Gene Stealer, and elite traits, and the text, "This unit gets +2 attack while it is at a planet with a warlord. This unit gets +2 HP while it is at a planet with a synapse unit." So, while it's certainly expensive relative to its printed statistics, this is nevertheless the very first Gene Stealer unit to be included and printed for the Tyranid faction. We've certainly seen a number of spoiled cards throughout the upcoming Planetfall cycle of war packs that expand upon that Gene Stealer trait and provide it with several useful synergies, but just how exactly the Yumgarl Gene Stealer stands to benefit from additional trait complementary cards stands, at this point, entirely left to be seen and wholly unknown to us. as with every other expensive Tyranid elite, it stands to become far more affordable if you can manage to get a cost-reducing digestion pool support into play, and can deploy this unit at an infested planet. But even taking that into consideration, I'm not so sure I'm convinced, at least in theory, by this elite. For instance, although it stands to gain 2 hit points when fighting alongside your Synapse unit of choice, considering just how powerful and indeed valuable those units are, it stands to reason that your opponent will simply attempt to focus down and kill your Synapse unit prior to it having any ability to retreat. And if they're directing their firepower away from the Gene Stealer, and it isn't actually tanking damage, then it doesn't stand to derive any benefit whatsoever from additional hit points. Plus, the moment it has 4 or more damage tokens, as soon as your Synapse unit retreats or dies, the Ymgarl Gene Stealer itself is immediately destroyed. So, while that additional, albeit unfortunately ephemeral, extra HP can potentially allow you to, on occasion, squeeze in an extra round or 2 of attacks prior to the Gene Stealer unit being killed, if your opponent is trying to kill it and not your chosen Synapse creature, perhaps because you selected something along the lines of a 0-attack Gravid Turvagon, perhaps, I still don't think that's very likely to happen. And without the presence of a Synapse unit, 4 hit points for a cost of 5 resources, frankly seems like not so much a worthwhile investment. I think it's much more of a realistic possibility that, opposed to deriving that hit point benefit, if fighting alongside your Warlord, you will actually be able to see the possibility of much greater utility from that additional attack power boost. But even then, an attack value of 4 may well be sufficient to destroy whatever you're going up against. And 2 extra attack could, in all likelihood, ultimately prove to be unnecessary overkill. Not always by any means, but at times most definitely. Still, a bit of attack value insurance, certainly often enough, doesn't hurt at all, and if your opponent is playing shield cards fast and furious, or has their 2 or perhaps even 3 icon cards kept in reserve, or if it's simply of the absolute utmost importance you do kill whatever it is you happen to be attacking, maybe something along the lines of an area effect laden enemy elite unit, then the Ymgarl Gene Stealer may, in the end, ultimately prove to be an alluring and appetitive elite option for you. Still, while the same pitfalls and vulnerabilities as ever before once again continue to present themselves, this is, nevertheless, yet another compelling option if you're considering supplementing your deck with a powerful elite inclusion. I think possibly one of the absolute best case use for this Gene Stealer, however, would be alongside Old One-Eye, perhaps, because at least in that situation your opponent has to choose between attempting to destroy this, in that case 6-attack army unit, or otherwise trying instead to bloody your readily regenerating and entirely brutal keyword eligible Carnifex Warlord. So I suppose I'll end our elite coverage by saying, have I mentioned yet that I'm looking forward to actually playtesting our new Tyranids? So, now that we've covered the very last of our standard and elite Tyranid armed forces, on to 5 different attachments. The first of which is the Noxious Flesh Borer, with a cost of 1, a single printed shield icon, and the war gear and biomorph traits. It reads, attached to an army unit, attached unit gets +1 attack and +1 HP while it's at an infested planet, as well as reaction. After you win a command struggle at this planet, infest it. So, if the attached unit happens to be sitting at an infested planet, for a small resource investment, as soon as you affix this attachment, it gains a very small attack and hit point boost. But that attached unit also runs the risk that, if it amasses damage equal to its printed HP value, and ever happens to leave an infested planet, whether through relocation or retreat, it's immediately destroyed. I do like that this provides the Tyranid player yet another means of infesting a planet, so long as you can win command struggles at the attached unit's location, and I think it's certainly worth pointing out, and this is something that I had confirmed by the Conquest development team, if this just so happens to be affixed to a toxic venomthrope, if you're at an uninfested planet and happen to win a command struggle, you cannot opt to trigger the flesh borer's reaction to infest the planet and then activate the reaction of the toxic venomthrope in order to gain your choice of bonus card or resource. Because the planet was not infested at the time of that command struggle victory, you unfortunately cannot stack those two card effects in the sequence of your choosing. So they key off the same triggering event, but you can't actually manipulate that situation in your favor. Still, you can serve to grant your Venomthrope a single point of attack power, or simply give any other Tyranid army unit a somewhat situational boost. But what's especially interesting is that relative to other factions, none of the Tyranid elite army units we discussed happen to have a no war gear restriction, so they, just like any other Tyranid army units, are entirely eligible for most of these attachments we're about to cover. So, while I don't see tremendous compulsion or impetus to run Noxious Flesh Borer at the moment, the Warp Storm immunity inherent to attachments is nice. Frankly, I don't think it's doing enough quite yet, nor is it sufficiently synergistic with our current card pool to warrant inclusion in at least any of my first several Tyranid decks. The notion of repeatable infestation is alluring, most definitely, but given the difficulty behind actually moving Tyranid units, and that I'm personally not a huge fan at face value of the Venomthrope Polluter, though certainly your opinion may differ, this card may ultimately just not be for me or for you, but maybe it is, and I can certainly respect the possibilities and opinions of others. So, a Tyranid warrior infesting a planet only to then proceed to sit there with 2 command icons, an attack value of 3, and a sizable pool of 5 hit points. Just like I said, very interesting possibilities to consider most definitely, but only time and playtesting will ultimately tell. Next up for our attachments, we have the Heavy Venom Cannon, with a cost of 3, 2 printed shield icons, and the War Gear and Biomorph traits. It must be attached to an elite army unit, and confers the attached unit +2 attack. It reads Combat Action. Attached unit, until the end of the phase, gains either Choose 1, Area Effect 2, or Armor Bane. Limit once per phase. So, despite an initial steep upfront expense, this is a very potent card that tragically serves to make already high priority target units all the more alluring for your opponent to bring down through the likes of the Fury of Sicarius or Klavex War Leader. Still, if you can get this to work, the possibilities are absolutely absurd. For instance, a 9-attack Armor Bane Burrowing Trigon Flygon is almost nonsensically powerful, as would be an 8-attack Armorbane Yumgarl Gene Stealer. Still, at that point, you have to consider just how many cards and resources you're likely investing for no significant additional benefit, apart from maybe a keyword. For instance, if you already have a 6 or 7 value attacker, do you really need to boost that by an additional 2? Is your opponent really holding on to so many 2 and even their 3 shield icon value cards that you'd need to genuinely make use of that Armorbane ability? Certainly there are some situations where your answer will be a resounding yes, but more often than not, I think it's going to be utter overkill, and those resources may simply be better spent elsewhere. Area Effect 2 is great for sure, and certainly the Tyranid player has exceptionally limited options to obtain that Area Effect keyword, which is proven to be so enormously effective time and time again against our current high unit count, low resource cost meta. But the cost required to benefit from this effect, considering that this can only be played on elite units, is pretty enormous, and quite likely just simply not worth it. Nevertheless, I do think that this card will see deck inclusion simply by merit of its having a rather large shield value, but the number of times it'll actually see play, well, I can't help but remain skeptical. And lastly, I'll just mention, for what it's worth, using Area Effect does count as an attack, so if it just so happens that you choose to affix a heavy venom cannon to a shrieking harpy, you can not only deal out a potentially devastating volley of 2 damage to all present enemy units, but additionally, you can also serve to exhaust all non-elite token and army units that happen to be facing off against you on the opposite side of the battlefield. So, next in our series of attachments is the Pincer Tail, with a cost of 1 shield icon, and the War Gear and Biomorph traits. It reads, attached to an army unit. Attached unit gets +1 attack and reaction. After attached unit damages an enemy non-warlord unit by an attack, the damaged unit cannot retreat before the start of the next combat round. So, albeit an army unit exclusive, this attachment serves to grant a small attack bonus and prevent a successfully damaged non-warlord from being able to retreat during that current combat round. This serves the purpose of prolonging a combat and potentially allows you the opportunity to pin down an enemy unit of your choice, hopefully ensuring that it can at least eventually be killed prior to a chance for it ultimately to possess any opportunity to escape you. The problem, however, is that you do have to damage the unit, so if your opponent can shield away that damage, they are ultimately going to be able to run away from you. And even if their unit is forced to stay, by no means does that mean that their unit isn't going to be attacking you if given the opportunity. Though, in that case, it's definitely worth noting that this retreat prevention effect does happen to persist, even if the attached unit happens to be destroyed. Still, cards like the Termagant Horde do benefit from participating in as many rounds of combat as possible, in that they spawn a new Termagant token at the beginning of each and every combat round. So, if you're opting to run multiple copies of that unit, then this card might be worth considering, It's not great per se, but this attachment can nevertheless lock down high-value enemy targets and, in the right situation, can prove to be relatively useful, so it may be worth trying. It's definitely not setting the world on fire, but in a pinch, the pincer tail could, perhaps, end up doing a decent bit of work for you. But next up, our penultimate attachment is Regeneration. With a cost of 1 shield icon, and the condition trait, it has the text attached to an army unit. Limit 1 per unit. Attached unit gets +2 HP. Action: exhaust this attachment to remove 2 damage from attached unit. So, far more effective than its Warhammer 40,000 tabletop counterpart, Regeneration not only grants an immediate substantial hit point boost immediately upon its being attached, but it also allows you to strip up to 2 points of damage away from the bestowed unit each and every time you happen to possess the opportunity to exhaust this attachment. And given our present card pool, that's essentially limited to 1 time per round, although at some point in the future that may very well change. Still, in any case, that effect combined with shield cards can be incredible in almost guaranteeing that some of your most valuable army units can remain alive for as long as possible, and whether you opt to affix this to the likes of a Termagant spawning Termagant Horde, or perhaps a Hive Mind specialization unit that grants all present tokens plus to their attack, command icon value, or even the ranged or area effect keywords, whatever your target may be, this attachment could prove to be yet another invaluable means of maintaining the health and well-being of some of your absolute most critically important units. It's cheap, it's reusable, and despite its limit of 1 per unit, in addition to being ineligible for attachment to either your Synapse or Warlord units, it's nevertheless exceptionally powerful given its cost. Of course, it goes without saying that it also confers Warp Storm immunity, but in all honesty, apart from the obvious weakness to Klavex War Leader and similar always going to be aggravating type card effects, I can't think of anything significantly negative to say about it. It's a respectably powerful, totally playable attachment, and the best part is, relative to its tabletop 40k counterpart at least, is that you don't even have to rely on a die roll in order to remove those 2 damage tokens. So, last of our Tyranid attachments, we have the Parasitic Infection. At a cost of 2, it has 1 shield icon, as well as the condition trait. It reads attached to an enemy army unit, as well as reaction. After the combat phase begins, put 1 Termagant token into play at this planet, and deal attached unit 1 damage. So, this strikes me as a rather interesting card. Certainly it's rather expensive, but it also happens to allow you to put Termagant tokens into play, and at that, potentially several times over the course of several rounds of the game. You simply attach this card to the enemy army unit of your choice, and it slowly but surely incurs 1 point of damage for each and every remaining round of the game, so long as it remains alive, and also serves the additional benefit to you of spawning a Termagant token at that unit's planet. And, considering that a battle isn't necessarily guaranteed to be taking place at that location of the chosen infected unit, for that reason it's entirely possible that multiple tokens may have entered play prior to your ultimately, perhaps inevitably, deciding to engage that unit in combat, so that when you eventually do, your standing forces serve to be all the more effectively supplemented by those standing Termagant tokens. And, really for that reason, I could see it synergizing reasonably well with something along the lines of a Savage Warrior Prime. You could use this attachment to soften up a somewhat too tough or overlarge meal for our Tyranid Warrior Synapse unit, and then, when the time is right, he could maybe swoop in and deal the killing blow. It's certainly worth noting that your opponent need not incur that single point of damage if they choose not to, seeing as how it's perfectly eligible to shield against, but whether they block that damage or not, they are entirely incapable and wholly unable to prevent the generation of that Termagant token each and every round, at least until their unit does eventually end up in the discard pile, whether it's through destruction or sacrifice. So, given the fact that you may not actually deal any damage to the attached units, but you may very well create several Termagant tokens nevertheless, seeing as how this attachment will at least always apply additional pressure over time on your opponent to keep spending cards as shields, even though you may never outright kill many or even any units through this attachment alone, the value of this card seems like it's going to vary dramatically, and personally that really kind of puts me somewhat off of it. So it could be quite useful in encouraging your opponent to effectively throw away one of their units by forcing it, maybe foolishly or erroneously, into a battle with you prematurely or suboptimally, so that they can maybe prevent that token stockpile from forming in the first place. Or it's also possible that this attachment may simply prove to be just not that effective and essentially ineffectual entirely. Still, whether it makes a huge difference or not, and whether or not it eventually seems worth the required investment of 2 resources, that kind of remains to be seen, and it's definitely going to vary between game to game regardless, so I think it could be great when affixed to an enemy flyer, seeing as how that single point of damage does at least circumvent being split in half or reduced by that flying keyword, but even still, I can't help but remain skeptical, and I'm going to have to be convinced, I think, during actual games before I consider this one worthy of frequent deck inclusion. So, it could be fantastic in a Termagant and Hive Mind intensive deck to really take advantage of those synergies, but at the moment, I happen to remain somewhat unconvinced as to whether or not this card is simply decent, if it's bad, or potentially, and in the right situation, it could ultimately prove to be something truly stellar. But now that we've covered our attachments and army units, we draw ever closer to our inevitable end in introducing 4 remaining supports. First up is Brood Chamber, with a cost of 0 and the location trait. It reads Combat Action. Exhaust this support to give a target army unit you control a keyword and all associated values printed on a target enemy unit at that planet until the end of the phase. So, clearly a card that is going to be wildly inconsistent. It's nevertheless hard to go wrong when it comes to putting a card into play for free. It eats a deploy action and forces your opponent a single step closer during the deploy phase to having to pass, which could potentially serve to help set you up into the preferable, ideal, and optimal deployment scenario where you can continue to play command icon laden units, strategically about the Traxxas sector in order to maximize your winning as many command struggles as possible. But that can indeed be said for playing any card in the game. So, in taking a look at this specific support, specifically for its effect, it's definitely worth considering the possibilities, albeit in the context of this card's printed restrictions. So, while it is possible that you can give any target army unit an additional keyword, the unit from which you're replicating that ability must be present at the same planet as your own target unit. So, for instance, if you give one of your own units ranged, unless you happen to have the initiative token as well, if your opponent can simply use their own ranged unit to pick off your keyword added unit first, then maybe you aren't ultimately accomplishing anything through this support. But perhaps, on the flip side, you might just be able to pick off some immensely valuable unit of theirs after all. Perhaps if that ranged keyword you're copying happens to be printed on some low-cost, at that moment, essentially ineffectual army units, like the one-attack, albeit ranged, Viorla Marksman. Or you might be able to make use of the always powerful Armor Bane, or flying, or even area effect. And considering that copying that keyword persists until the very end of the phase, that could ultimately prove to be quite powerful indeed. And at the very least, I suppose, you might alter your opponent's target priority to something more favorable for you. But giving something along the lines of, in an extreme example, the burrowing Trigon, the flying keyword, which you may well have borrowed from a 2-attack, 2-hit point flying enemy Hellion gang, well, quite simply put, that could prove to be almost absurdly powerful. And similarly, copying area effect could also be exceptionally strong. And if you're targeting a unit of your own that already happens to have area effect, it's always worth remembering that each and every instance of that area effect keyword happens to be additive, so those values combine together in order to yield an all the more devastating area effect volley. Really and honestly, the main limitation of this support is the complete reliance on whatever it is your opponent happens to be bringing into play against you, and whether or not you'll be able to make use of that associated keyword at any given moment, which certainly isn't always the case. But as one final note, I think it's worth mentioning that it serves no benefit whatsoever if you happen to copy the keyword mobility, seeing as how this support has to wait to be used until the first action window of the combat phase. But while I'm not entirely convinced by this card based purely on the consistency of its usefulness alone, as with so many of these Tyranid cards, I nevertheless remain entirely open to being someday soon convinced otherwise. Still, next in line, we have yet another support taking the form of Mycetic Spores, a 2-cost card with the upgrade trait, which reads Combat Action. Exhaust this support to move a unit you control with the Hive Mind specialization to a planet with a Termagant token. So, although it doesn't come cheap by any means, this support can nevertheless prove absolutely invaluable in acting to preserve or perhaps simply opportunistically relocate your critically important Hive Mind specialization units. If they're bound to be destroyed by enemy ranged fire, or your opponent simply happens to possess the initiative token, and you have no no other way around it. You can exhaust the support in order to whisk some of those valuable units of yours away off to safety, or, used in a more offensive sense, you can instead wait until immediately prior to your tokens being able to attack in order to pull something like a Strangler Brood to the planet upon which they're present, so that each and every one of them suddenly gains an additional point of attack value. Or, still further, perhaps prior to any battles taking place at all, you sneakily decide to shift in a Termagant Spikers to a planet where it can suddenly confer the ranged keyword to all present Termagant tokens. When it comes to this support and any or all of our Hive Mind specialization units, your options are myriad indeed. You could even move a Biovore Spore Launcher, which not only grants Area Effect 1 to any and all present Termagant tokens, but itself happens to be a 3-attack, 6-hit point monster that can end up ultimately doing a significant amount of damage during a battle. In fact, you could simply wait until all of your opponent's units have already attacked and are sitting at that planet entirely exhausted, and then opt to reel in your Biovore in order to launch a surprising swing for 3, or maybe just pull in a Swarm Guard instead, so that all of your standing Termagant tokens immediately suddenly gain +2 HP. Still, as we eventually almost certainly stand to see additional Hive Mind units introduced to our Tyranid faction, the options stand to become only even better and all the more diverse over time, so clearly, although the cost of this support is far from insignificant, I nevertheless do think that this non-unique support is exceptionally powerful in both a defensive and offensive sense. And if you're attempting to make use of Termagant tokens and employing that Hive Mind specialization, I definitely don't think that, at least initially, this card can come recommended enough. So, next up, and somewhat similar to the simplicity of predation, we have the Spore Chimney, yet another 2-cost support with the upgrade trait, but which happens to possess the text reaction. After the headquarters phase begins, infest a target planet. So, while it most certainly is not free, unlike our aforementioned infestation spreading event, it nevertheless is guaranteed each and every round, so long as it does remain in play, to spontaneously generate an infestation token absolutely anywhere you'd like for you to use during the subsequent round's deploy, command, and combat phases. By this point in the video, as we slowly near the end of our initial set of Tyranids, we've nevertheless covered a whole host of different effects that make very good use of infested planets. It certainly goes without saying that this card does ultimately require a bit of an upfront investment from you, seeing as how it costs 2 resources, but you don't actually get to derive any benefit until the turn after you end up playing it, because remember, it doesn't actually trigger until that round's HQ phase. But it also provides a repeatable, guaranteed means, unless destroyed by one of the scarcely few support hate cards thus far added to the game, of placing infestation tokens on literally any planet you'd like, whichever one happens to benefit you during that upcoming round the most. So, without going through all the already established and thoroughly aforementioned options, suffice it to say that you could save resources when playing units during the deploy phase thanks to the digestion pool, draw additional cards thanks to your toxic venomthropes during the command phase, spawn additional termagants with your gravid tervagon, on, and perhaps even exhaust and subsequently obliterate your opponent's army during combat with your Shrieking Harpy supplemented by any number of copies of Hunter Gargoyles that may very well have opportunistically swept in just to strike for a value of 2 for each and every copy you happen to have of that army unit. So, certainly interesting to be sure, but worthy of including within a deck. For that, I'm just not entirely convinced. So, powerful, most definitely, but necessary. I honestly think that just has to wait for formal playtesting to be genuinely seen. But last of our Tyranid supports, finally we have the exceptionally alluring Synaptic Link. It costs 2 resources, is also an upgrade trait support, but has the text Reaction. After a Synapse unit you control commits to a planet, draw 1 card. Critically important to note, this support is not unique, nor is it limited. You can play up to 3 copies, and, so long as your Synapse unit remains alive, each and every round, when you commit it to a planet during the command phase, you can draw a card. The only problem, however, is that it initially costs you the card it's printed upon, plus 2 resource tokens. So the first time you ultimately activate this effect, you essentially break even regarding invested cards, but at that point you're still down 2 resource tokens. Seeing as how many players roughly equate the value of a card to 1 or maybe 2 resources, once you've drawn your second card, you're starting to see a bit of a benefit, perhaps, and once you're past that point, it all seems to be icing on the cake. So, given that most games of Conquest are over in a mere handful of turns, usually lasting no more than 4 rounds the vast majority of the time, unless you're able to get this support into play very early indeed, I don't think you're tremendously likely to see a very significant benefit from it. It's certainly possible for sure, and the longer you can draw out a game, the more likely you are to derive all the more benefit from 1 or more copies of this support, but considering too that initial resource investment, seeing as how that might just prevent you from doing all that you can that turn to instead establish a strong, hopefully early game economy, and given that the Tyranids may struggle somewhat in a command sense in the first place, the resources required to get this card up and running just might be putting you at greater risk than it's ultimately worth. So, certainly something that seems like it could be of tremendous benefit, but I'm very curious indeed to see how it ultimately withstands the test of time. Much like the now maligned faction-specific army unit resource cost reduction supports, this may well start off as loved, only to have our community eventually turn their collective back upon it at some point in the future. So, its power, in my opinion, remains entirely yet to be seen. And plus, it's certainly worth considering that if at any point your Synapse unit ends up being killed, and remember that they have at most 5 hit points, any copies of this support you've already played are now entirely useless, and any additional copies that happen to be sitting in your hand, save for maybe on the rare occasion buffering against a possible, albeit usually infrequent, random forced discard, are, seeing as how this card simply has no shield value at all, doing quite literally absolutely nothing for you. Though, in any case, I think it's certainly worth noting that if for whatever reason you end up close to losing through inadvertently decking yourself, Just remember that drawing cards through this effect is indeed entirely optional, and it's also worth noting as well that you don't actually get to end up drawing that card until once you're well past that turn's deploy phase. So, as a result, hopefully whatever you end up drawing is going to be some kind of influential event, or otherwise, and at the very least, have some printed shield value. But still, it's hard to go wrong when it comes to drawing extra cards. You just definitely need to ask yourself, at what cost am I doing this? But now that we've rather exhaustively covered our last several Tyranid supports, our final cards introduced within the Great Devourer Deluxe box set are a trio of powerful events, starting off with the delightfully titled Clogged with Corpses. For a cost of 0 resource tokens, it happens to possess 1 printed shield icon, the tactic trait, and the text Action. Sacrifice X Termagant units to destroy a target support card with printed cost X or lower. So, despite circumventing any resource requirement whatsoever, you're instead forced to sacrifice a number of Termagant trait units equivalent to the cost of whatever target support you'd like to see destroyed. So, although it isn't exactly a cheap effect, keep in mind it costs its own card plus X number of Termagants. Seeing as how you'll ideally include this in decks adept at Termagant manufacturing, it may not ultimately prove much of a difficulty in order to trigger this event. You can certainly opt to sacrifice Termagant tokens, and if you happen to be playing the Swarmlord and or the Gravid Tervigon, you're likely to possess those Termagant tokens in spades. In fact, through those 2 cards alone, you're entirely able, and in fact quite likely, to spawn 4 Termagant units each and every round without the help of even a single additional card effect. But still further, cards like Termagant Horde can also serve to provide a host of expendable units, and in a pinch, you're even able to sacrifice some of your non-token Termagant army units in order to fund this event if you find yourself in dire straits. Perhaps you want to destroy Packmaster Kith's Chimera Den, so that she isn't able to destroy some of your most valuable units, if not all of your hive mind forces, at the very end of a combat round, and once all your units are exhausted so that she can opportunistically relocate her own token Chimera. Or, perhaps, another example might be that you'd like to prevent an Astra Militarum player's Inquisitorial Fortress from routing your own powerful Tyranid elites or otherwise linchpin hivemind units. Or, still further, maybe you simply want to prevent the likes of An-Shi from being moved to your planet via the likes of a Ximien orbital city. Truly, the options are practically limitless, and the ability for you to destroy your opponent's signature or simply most valuable supports could, in and of itself, prove nearly invaluable. So, definitely a powerful card, not always useful, perhaps, but it can definitely make a monumental amount of difference in specific games, and in certain situations, quite likely spare you from the crushing jaws of defeat closing around you, particularly for factions and warlords like the aforementioned An-Shi that do end up relying just so heavily on their supports in order to get themselves into the most favorable board state possible. So, I think in many situations you can simply sacrifice Termagant tokens during the deploy phase, only to almost immediately replace them during command or combat, but Even if your opponent happens to starve you of deployment actions, seeing as how this event itself has the built-in flexibility of being an action with no phase-specific restriction, you can opt to play this at absolutely any time you'd like, so long as you have an action window with which to do so. Plus, it's even worth noting that sacrificing tokens can in and of itself be helpful. In some situations, for instance, if you're approaching maybe that 10 token limit and happen to have several of those tokens deployed at planets where they're quite simply not actually doing anything for you, you can use up your unnecessary, unwanted termagants to fund this event, only to subsequently replace them with those much more favorably positioned. And if you happen to have some that are currently exposed, for example, if some of your tokens just so happen to be set up in a sense where they might be easily destroyed by a Space Marines opponent with the resource-collecting Captain Cato Sicarius present at that planet, then giving up some of your tokens via sacrifice now, only to save them from being destroyed later, and hopefully also to end up in a much better position not far into the future of that very game round. All that together could ultimately work out in your favor indeed. But with yet another event covered, our penultimate Tyranid card, and yet another exceptionally powerful event is Consumption. For a monumental cost of 4 resources, it has a single printed shield icon, as well as the tactic trait. It reads Deploy action. Each player must sacrifice a unit at each planet if able. So, while this potentially devastatingly powerful, albeit rather indiscriminate event rewards the clever and tactical Tyranid player for buffering and supplementing their expensive armed forces with readily expendable termagant tokens, or perhaps simply low-value units, it similarly punishes your opponent for seeking to counter the spreading Tyranid swarm by either distributing their units across multiple planets within the Traxxas sector, or instead simply opting to spend their hard-earned income on a few expensive, albeit enormously powerful units. I think it's very likely that your opponent is going to want to put command units on as many planets as possible in order to secure in turn as many command struggle victories as they can, and even if you've been attempting to match them planet for planet, if you have a large number of tokens spread across multiple planets, or expendable units, or simply don't mind incurring the losses you might suffer just because you might be able to ultimately easily replenish them, then Consumption could provide an absolutely stellar and fantastic means of either leveling the playing field, catching up to an already established opponent, or perhaps, if your enemy has deployed carelessly, erroneously, or you've been able to encourage them to spread their investments thin across several different worlds, then playing this event might even be able to force your opponent into essentially putting the nail in their very own coffin. Though, of course, they hopefully won't realize what they're doing at the time. Plus, you could even lull your opponent into a false sense of security by having somewhat valuable units deployed alone, so that your opponent is entirely convinced you wouldn't dare to play this event. But perhaps if you precede playing it with the likes of a Spawn Termagants, at that point, it's well too late for your opponent to react, and then that 2-cost event that suddenly and immediately puts a Termagant token into play at each and every planet on the battlefield, albeit for the, at that point, total combined cost of 6 resources and 2 cards, could together nevertheless allow you to deal out an absolutely disastrous and, well, potentially catastrophic blow to your opponent. And still further indeed, if you can manage to wait to play this card until the very point during the deploy phase when it can hurt your opponent the most, perhaps immediately after they've laid out some powerful endgame elite alone at a planet, or until after they've managed to play out several units across the battlefield at several different planets, this event alone, or supplemented with an effect like Spawn Termagants or any number of others, can not only make an enormous difference itself, but can also set you up into an absolutely fantastic position for the remainder of that round, and quite possibly the rest of the game. Though the upfront expense required by this card is undeniably significant, if you're able to win an avalanche of cards and resources through myriad command struggle victories as the direct result of having played this event, then in addition to also depriving your opponent of those same cards and resources, given even further still that you're quite likely to, during that round's combat phase, absolutely decimate your opponent's still standing army, when played at the right time, I can't help but think that this event could serve the ultimate effect of turning even what may look like it was otherwise a complete, crushing, and certain defeat into what could, instead, in all likelihood, prove to be an at least eked out victory, if not win by utter landslide. But on to our very last event, and indeed final Tyranid card of the entirety of the Great Devourer Deluxe Expansion. Last but most certainly not least, we have Dark Cunning, a 2-cost event with a single shield icon, and yet another instance of the tactic trait. It reads Combat Action. Ready a target non-warlord unit you control. Then, if that unit is at an infested planet, gain 1 resource token. So, quite simply, this allows you the potentially quite powerful opportunity to either compensate for an opponent having exhausted one of your units, whether through something along the lines of Eldorath triggering his ability to exhaust one of your units during the command phase, or perhaps an Astra Militarum suppressive fire, forcing one of your units out of commission during the combat phase. But in either case, whether you're effectively countering that effect, or simply opting to take advantage of an additional action this turn, either way, this card, although certainly not free, can nevertheless certainly prove to be an enormously useful event. It can allow you to attack twice with the same ranged unit, or squeeze in an additional attack with one of your formidable elites. Attacking twice with something like a burrowing Trigon, for instance, or having an elite that happens to be wielding a heavy venom cannon opt instead to snap off 2 armor bane assaults, or twin area effect 2 volleys. Any of those possibilities could each be outright devastating, and by no means do the options end there. Even an essentially unimpressive conventional army unit, if granted the opportunity to launch an additional attack, could stand to be of enormous use to you. And if you happen to combine this event with the likes of Old One-Eye's signature event Ferocious Strength, conferring brutal to one of your Synapse units, the amount of surprise damage you could dish out to your enemy in not 1, but 2 brutal keyword attacks could not only be delightfully unexpected, but exceptionally effective and devastating indeed. Really, the only shame about this event is that apart from its obvious inability to target your warlord, your opponent is unfortunately able to predict exactly when you're able to play this event, seeing as how you do have to possess 2 available resource tokens to play this event, despite your possibly regaining one of those tokens after the fact, which, although that does happen to lessen the cost, it doesn't actually occur until after you've paid for and ultimately played this event. And, of course, that cost reduction effect only happens to take place if your target happens to be sitting at an infested planet. So, whether you're using this event to ensure that your ravenous Haruspecs can attempt again to secure its potential resource income for that round, or you're instead simply using it to dish out as much damage as possible, the options here are practically limitless. And as with so many other exciting Tyranid card effects, the utility serves only to expand and increase with time as our card pool ever grows and evolves. So, with that said, we finally come to the inevitable conclusion of this first look, my initial impressions, overview, and first pass analysis of our first wave of Tyranid faction cards. I very much hope you enjoyed listening to my rambling on and prattling endlessly about the cards for which myself and so many others have been so excitedly waiting for so long. So, thank you once again for watching. If you've made it this far, please take the time to leave a comment below letting me know exactly which card you're most excited about and why. Do you prefer the Swarm Lord, or are you more for Old One-Eye? Which is your favorite of our new Synapse units, and which Warlord and Synapse duo do you think is most likely to rise to prominence within the tournament scene? Do you personally view the Tyranids as a someday competitive faction, or do you think that they're doomed and destined to flounder? Please let me know your own thoughts, opinions, and initial impressions of any or even all of these cards in the comments section. But with all that out of the way, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you have not done so already. Share this channel with anyone you know who may happen to be interested at all in Conquest, as the more likes, the more shares, the more comments, all of it means that more eyes will ultimately end up on this video, on this channel, and by extension, on the entirety of our growing Conquest community. I made this channel out of a deep and genuine passion and love for this game, and I consider myself incredibly fortunate to be able to share something I enjoy so much with all of you. So, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to keep in touch with me on Facebook, and I always get so lonely on Twitter. So, thank you again, and as always, be sure to check back again soon for ever more excellent Conquest LCG content yet to come.